Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I never expected to hear voices from people who aren't alive anymore, but that's exactly what happened. It all started last year when I was testing a new set of audio recorders in an abandoned building near my town. I study weird sounds and unexplained audio frequencies. I make a living by investigating so-called haunted spots, but until that day, I had never recorded anything that felt truly real. I'd caught strange clicks, faint whispers, and static signals that others interpreted as proof of ghosts. Still, I always assumed it was interference or random noise. Then I found the old banquet hall hidden inside that property, and everything changed. The place was a crumbling mess. Paint peeled off the walls and the ceiling sagged in some spots. I could smell dust, mold, and stale air. The floors creaked under my boots, and sometimes I worried one of the boards would snap. I had this cheap flashlight that flickered whenever I moved it too fast. It felt like the building itself didn't want me there, but I brushed off that feeling. I was used to being in creepy places for my research. I set up my equipment in the main hall. A few battered tables and chairs stood scattered around. Some old decorations, like faded streamers, still clung to the walls. I figured they were from decades ago, probably from a party or some kind of celebration. The building's record said it used to be a popular venue for local gatherings, but I'd only found bits and pieces of information. I assumed I'd spend a few hours there, capture some random static, then head home and review it later. My plan was simple. I arranged my microphones at different spots. I placed a frequency scanner near one corner of the room where the floor felt sturdier. I aligned a directional microphone near the stage, which was just a small raised platform covered in chipped wood. I turned on my handheld recorder and spoke my usual notes into it. I marked the date, time, and location, and I mentioned the condition of the place. My voice echoed in the silence. Then I waited. I listened to the building breathe. The wind outside rattled the windows. My own breathing sounded too loud in my ears. I tapped on my handheld recorder to check if it was still running. Everything was normal for the first hour. I sat on a folding chair, scanning through the frequencies on my laptop, hoping to catch something interesting. I noticed a short burst of static that seemed to repeat every few minutes, but it was faint. I thought it was just old wiring or maybe a fault in my microphone. After about 2 hours, I heard a voice that didn't belong to me. It was a quick line of speech, too muffled to make out actual words. It sounded excited, like someone greeting a friend. I jumped to my feet and checked my meters. I saw a small spike in the lower mid-range. I pressed the playback on my recorder. The voice repeated. It was definitely a person speaking. I felt a chill run down my spine. My neck stiffened, my mouth went dry, and my heart pounded a little harder. I spoke out loud, asking if someone was there. I felt awkward talking to an empty room, but I'd done that routine many times before. I got static in response. I noticed that the repeating burst of static on my frequency scanner began to change. The pattern shifted, and I could hear faint music in the background, like an old song from a big band era. I moved closer to the corner where I'd placed the scanner. I swore I could feel the floor vibrating a little. It wasn't strong, but it felt like there was movement below the surface. I turned my head and saw a faint shape near the stage. It wasn't a person. It was more like a smudge in the air, but it moved. My breath caught in my throat. I tried shining my flashlight on it, but the light just lit up dust particles. The shape vanished. I tried to keep calm. I wiped sweat off my forehead and checked the recordings again. Suddenly, I heard more voices. They overlapped, like people chatting at a party. I recognized bits of laughter, the clink of glass, and the shuffle of feet across a floor. It got louder. I looked around the hall. It still looked empty and abandoned, but my ears told me there was a gathering happening right in front of me. I moved my recorder around and the voices shifted in my headphones. I could hear them better when I pointed the microphone at the center of the room. I walked slowly to that area. My chest felt tight, but curiosity pushed me forward. I wanted to see if there was some kind of trick or hidden speaker. I didn't find anything. The voices sounded real, but nobody was there. A man said, "Welcome, everyone," in a cheerful tone. A woman replied, "Thanks for having us," with a laugh. It felt bizarre. I pulled out a second recorder to see if it would pick up the same audio. It did. I spent the next half hour recording what seemed like an entire event. I heard them talking about a special occasion. Something about an anniversary and how nice the decorations looked. They praised the music. I heard more laughter and the sounds of people moving chairs. My hands shook a bit. My arms felt cold. I tried not to freak out, but I could hardly focus on anything other than the voices. They sounded stuck in a loop, repeating the same greetings every few minutes, but sometimes they'd add new lines. It was like listening to a memory that wouldn't end. I realized these spirits didn't know they were repeating themselves. They acted like it was happening for the first time. I'd catch phrases like, "Have you tried the punch yet?" Or, "This place looks beautiful tonight." Then after a while, they'd start over. I felt a strange sympathy for them, even though I didn't fully understand what was going on. I wondered if they'd notice me, but they never did. When I stood in the center of the room, the hair on my arms rose. I felt a slight temperature drop. It was like stepping into a bubble of cold air. The air around me felt heavier. I could almost sense the swirl of invisible people around me, crossing from one side of the hall to the other. The smell in that spot changed. Instead of musty mold, it had a faint hint of perfume and cooked food. It wasn't strong, but it was there. I stayed until midnight, capturing everything I could on my recorders. By the time I left, my laptop battery was almost dead. I heard the voices until I stepped out of the building. The second I was outside, the sound stopped. The night was quiet, except for a few distant cars and some wind in the trees. I drove back home and barely slept. My mind wouldn't stop racing with questions. Over the next few weeks, I returned to the building multiple times. Each trip was similar. I'd hear the same party playing out. It lasted for hours, sometimes with small changes or new conversations. I noticed the environment in the building looked slightly different each time. A chair might be in a new spot. A table might have shifted a few inches. One day I found fresh footprints in the dust. They weren't mine. I felt uneasy. I started to suspect that whatever these spirits were doing, it had some effect on the physical space. I also began to worry about my own perception. At home, I'd swear I heard distant chatter in my office. I checked my equipment for interference. I checked if my neighbors had their TV on. Nothing explained it. Sometimes I'd get a whiff of that same perfume smell in my kitchen or my living room. I'd walk around, trying to find the source, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. I felt an underlying tension that wouldn't let go. One day I brought a friend with me. He's another researcher who deals with electromagnetic fields. He set up his own gear in the same hall. We didn't tell each other what we were recording until we finished, to avoid bias. Later, when we compared notes, he had the exact same voices and the same background music. He also mentioned feeling cold spots. That confirmed I wasn't making it up. We both agreed that these spirits were stuck in some kind of time loop, unaware of their situation. As weeks turned into months, I noticed that my recordings changed in subtle ways. The party loop got longer, and more details showed up. People started mentioning events that were happening in their time decades ago. They talked about the local town fair and an upcoming parade. They joked about an old mayor who had given a speech earlier that week. The loop expanded, like it was a bubble of the past stretching out. My friend and I tried different microphones, different frequency ranges, and even different nights of the week. The voices persisted. Then we realized something else. Our presence was affecting them too. We started hearing references to small noises in the hall. People at the party would say, "Did you hear that?" Or, "I feel a draft coming from over there." Sometimes they'd say it was just the wind, but other times they'd seem more concerned. Once a woman said, "Who left that chair in the middle of the floor?" We saw that same chair out of place in the present. It was like we were crossing into their loop without meaning to. I began to worry about the consequences of messing with this phenomenon. The building's walls seemed thinner every time I went. I could see small movements in the corners of my vision. I'd spin around, and of course, nothing would be there. My friend suggested we take a break, but I was too intrigued. I wanted a definitive explanation. One night, I decided to stay longer than usual. I arrived in the evening and planned to stay until dawn. I brought extra batteries, food, and water. I set up everything in the main hall as I'd done many times before. The voices started around 10 at night. They were louder than before. I could hear multiple conversations at once, almost like the entire event was happening live. I walked around to see if I could interact with them. I said, "Hello," out loud, hoping for a response. At first, I only heard them carrying on with their celebration, but around midnight, one of the voices mentioned a strange echo in the room. Another voice asked if someone was messing with the microphone. That made my heart race. I clutched my recorder tighter. My palms felt clammy. I stood still, staring at the empty stage. Then I heard it again. A man said, "It sounds like there's someone else here." I felt goosebumps on my arms and a knot in my stomach. I noticed the temperature drop again. I took a step back and bumped into a table. The table scooted an inch and made a scraping noise on the floor. In my headphones, I heard gasps and a shuffle of movement. They reacted to that sound. A woman said, "What's going on?" Another voice said, "I think we should check the lights." It was the first time they acknowledged something outside their normal loop. The entire hall felt charged, like static electricity in the air. My friend wasn't with me that night, so I was alone. I tried to keep calm, but my legs shook. I kept the recorder rolling, even though I wanted to run out of there. A male voice in the loop called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" I took a deep breath and said, "I'm here." I waited. My heart thumped in my chest. I heard a faint response, but it was too garbled to understand. Then everything went quiet. I stood there, listening to my own breathing. The party noises vanished. The music disappeared. I checked my devices and realized the frequency signals had flatlined. No static, no voices, nothing. The cold spot faded, replaced by the normal stale warmth of the building. I stayed for another hour, but the loop didn't come back that night. The next day, I reviewed the audio. The moment where I bumped the table, the voices responded with real fear. It sounded like they thought something bad was happening. Then it all cut off. I have no clue if I disrupted their cycle or if they just shifted to some other frequency. After that, whenever I returned to the building, I didn't hear the party anymore. The place felt dead again, just an old broken hall with dusty furniture and creaking floors. My friend couldn't capture anything either. I still have all the recordings. I can play them for anyone who doubts me. You can hear that party. You can listen to them joking around, talking about everyday things from decades ago. You can hear their reactions when something from the present intrudes on their endless celebration. I haven't shared the files publicly because I'm not sure if it's safe or responsible. Part of me wonders if I'll ever find another spot like that. Another part wonders if those spirits are still out there, looping through time, repeating the same night over and over. But for now, the voices are gone, and I'm left with nothing but my gear, my notes, and the unsettling feeling that I touched something I wasn't meant to touch. I got the call about a month ago. My uncle's lawyer said I was the sole inheritor of an old mansion he owned. I wasn't excited at first because I live in a small city apartment and don't want extra headaches. But I'm a real estate agent, and I saw a chance to flip the place for a nice profit. I decided to move in temporarily, oversee the renovations, then list it when everything was ready. I didn't expect anything strange. I just wanted to get in, do my job, and move on. The first time I drove up to the mansion, I felt a jolt of surprise when I saw the front gates. They were rusty but massive, and they creaked loud when I pushed them open. The driveway had cracked asphalt, and weeds poked through the gaps. The front yard looked neglected, with dead leaves piled up against a large stone fountain that didn't work anymore. The mansion itself had tall windows, chipped paint, and a heavy wooden door at the entrance. I could smell damp air the moment I walked up to it. Inside, I found a long hallway that led to a spacious living room on the right and a dining room on the left. The floors were hardwood, but they felt uneven under my feet. The walls had peeling wallpaper and stains from old water leaks. There were light fixtures that still worked, but most of them flickered. I had a flashlight in my backpack just in case. The place felt stuffy, like nobody had aired it out in years. I started cleaning up on the first day. I cleared the dust off the furniture in the living room. I wiped the tables and shelves. I found old books stacked in a corner, some with moldy pages. I opened a few windows to let fresh air in. I had to brush off spider webs from the corners of the ceiling. While I worked, I thought about how I would pitch this property to potential buyers. I figured I could play up the historic charm angle, maybe highlight some of the original woodwork. The place had big rooms and decent natural light. Renovations would cost a bit, but I could see potential in the layout. The first night I slept there, I used a small guest room upstairs. It had a simple bed, a nightstand, and a tiny closet. The mattress felt stale, but I was too tired to care. I set an alarm on my phone for 7 a.m. Planning to meet contractors in the morning, I fell asleep fast. Around midnight, I jolted awake. I heard a faint sound that made me sit up. It was piano music. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. It played a repetitive, soft melody. At first, I wondered if I left a radio on, but I didn't remember bringing a radio. I got out of bed, grabbed my phone, and stepped into the hallway. The mansion was dark. I walked to the top of the stairs, hoping to trace the sound. It seemed to come from below. I walked down to the first floor, passed through the living room, and reached a stairwell that I hadn't explored yet. It led down to the basement. The door was closed, and it looked stiff. I turned the knob, but it barely budged. The music was definitely coming from behind that door. I pushed harder, and the door opened with a crack. The piano sounds got louder. I walked down the narrow steps. The walls were concrete, and the air was chilly. I felt goosebumps on my arms. My heart thumped in my chest. I tried to stay calm, but it felt like I was stepping into someone else's space. There was a musty smell that reminded me of wet cardboard. The music continued, the same loop of notes. I reached the bottom and found a plain basement room with old shelves, a workbench, and some boxes. There was no piano. The music just stopped. 1 second it was there, and then silence. My phone showed it was 12:14 a.m. I stood there for a while, confused. I used my phone's flashlight and scanned every corner of the basement. I didn't see any speakers or stereo equipment. Nothing. I felt a chill run through me, so I hurried back upstairs and locked the door behind me. I told myself maybe I was dreaming or half asleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. The next morning, I brushed off the incident. The contractors showed up around 8. They examined the roof, the wiring, the plumbing. I took notes. The place needed more work than I expected. The estimate was high, and I told them I'd think about it. After they left, I focused on smaller tasks like cleaning out closets and checking each room for damage. By the end of the day, I was exhausted. I ate a quick dinner of canned soup and bread, then went to bed early. I made sure to keep the basement door locked. I wanted to avoid any strange noises. I woke up the second night around 2 a.m. to the same piano music. It was louder than before, and it had a certain rhythm that felt repetitive. I felt a weird buzzing in my head as I listened. My eyes felt heavy, and I realized I wasn't fully awake. I got up and stumbled out of my room. My legs felt wobbly, but I forced myself to move. I reached the stairwell to the basement, and the door was open this time, even though I had locked it. The piano loop pulled me in like I was on autopilot. I remember stepping onto the first stair. I blinked, and suddenly, I was standing in the middle of the basement, in the dark. The music had stopped. I looked around, breathing hard. My phone said it was 4:46 a.m. I couldn't remember anything between stepping onto the stair and that moment. I had lost nearly 3 hours. My heart pounded. My palms were sweaty. I hurried upstairs, feeling unsettled. My mind raced. I tried to recall what had happened, but there was a blank space. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. wondering if I was losing it. The next day, I decided to stay busy. I tried patching some of the walls in the living room and pulling up a few loose boards on the porch. I made phone calls to other contractors, hoping to get a lower bid. I set up a security camera app on my phone, using a camera I found in one of the closets. It was old, but it worked. I pointed it at the basement door, thinking maybe I could catch something on video if it happened again. By evening, I felt a dull headache. I blamed stress. That night, I set up a lamp in my room and kept it on. I left my phone plugged in next to me so I could record audio if I heard the piano again. I forced myself to stay awake by scrolling through real estate listings. Around 11 p.m., I started drifting off. The next thing I knew, I was downstairs walking toward the basement door. The piano music was playing. It had a slow, dragging sound that made my stomach twist. My head felt foggy. My arms felt heavy. I tried to resist the urge to go down there, but it felt impossible. My legs moved on their own. I went down the steps. My phone light was on, but I didn't remember turning it on. I saw the camera I'd set up in the corner. The lens was pointed at the door, but I didn't stop. I walked right to the center of the basement and stood there listening. The music echoed off the concrete walls, but I still couldn't see any instrument. Then the music stopped, and everything went black. When I snapped out of it, I was upstairs in my bed, still wearing my shoes. My phone lay on the floor. It was 6 a.m. My body felt stiff and my mouth was dry. I checked my phone and saw that the camera app had recorded some footage. I opened the video. The screen showed me walking to the door at 12:30 a.m. Then, a flash of static. After that, the video showed me standing motionless in front of the camera for about 5 minutes. Then, another burst of static. The feed came back at 2 a.m., showing an empty basement. I was gone from the frame. Then it ended. No sign of the piano, no sound except faint static. I felt panic building in my chest. I went to the bathroom, splashed water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were bloodshot. My skin felt clammy. I wondered if I was sleepwalking or having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. But the camera footage showed I was definitely awake, at least physically. Over the next few days, I tried keeping myself awake with coffee and energy drinks. I even took short naps during the day, hoping I'd sleep less at night. I didn't want to hear that music again. I started noticing that every time I got near the basement door during the daytime, I felt uneasy. My stomach would tense up and I'd get a queasy feeling. I resisted any urge to open it. I told myself I'd wait until I found some rational explanation, maybe call an electrician or an audio specialist, but I couldn't figure out how any of that would produce random piano music. I also noticed small details around the house that didn't add up. Sometimes I'd find footprints in dusty corners of the basement, even though I wore the same pair of boots each time I went down. Sometimes I'd find the basement door unlocked in the morning, even though I swore I locked it at night. Once I found a dropped flashlight by the furnace. It wasn't mine and it looked old. I kept losing chunks of time. It always happened after midnight. I'd hear the piano, then everything went blank. I'd come to hours later, feeling sore and confused. I tried setting multiple alarms on my phone at random intervals through the night, hoping that one of them would snap me out of the trance or whatever it was. But half the time, I'd find my phone's alarm turned off, like I had shut it off in my sleep. One evening, I decided to barricade the basement door with a heavy wooden dresser. I thought maybe I could block myself from going down there. I dragged the dresser from the dining room, pushed it against the door, and stuck a chair under the doorknob. That night, I drank 2 strong coffees and watched TV in the living room until I felt my eyes closing. My plan was to stay downstairs, far from my bed, so I wouldn't be tempted to go upstairs and walk to the basement. Around midnight, I heard the first notes of that piano melody. My heart started racing. I sat up, turned off the TV, and listened. The notes were coming from behind the basement door again, muffled but persistent. I told myself, stay put, don't move. But I started shaking. My breathing got shallow, and my forehead was slick with sweat. The next thing I remember, I was standing in front of the barricaded door. The dresser was pushed aside. The chair was lying on its side. The door was wide open. I was halfway down the steps before I realized what was happening. My legs were moving on their own and the piano sounded louder. I felt a squeezing pressure in my temples. My vision blurred. The music kept looping. Then everything went dark. I woke up on the cold basement floor, face down. My shoulder ached. My phone was in my hand. The screen cracked. It said 5:10 a.m. I sat up slowly. My entire body was trembling. The basement felt damp and I could hear water dripping from a pipe somewhere. I stood up, found the stairs and dragged myself back to the living room. My throat felt raw. I noticed the dresser was back in the dining room. I had no idea how I moved it. I felt fear spike in my chest. I had no memory of doing that. I spent the rest of the morning pacing around, trying to decide if I should just leave. But I didn't want to give up that easily. This was my inheritance, and I needed the money from this property. I told myself maybe I could hire someone to seal off the basement entirely or remove the door. But I still didn't know what was causing the music. The next day, I tried talking to a neighbor who lived a mile away. He was an older guy who said he remembered my uncle. He said my uncle stayed in that mansion off and on. He mentioned that my uncle once complained about strange noises at night. But the neighbor didn't have details. He just shrugged and said the place always felt off. That night, I decided I wasn't going to let the music control me. I set up more cameras, this time with battery backups. I placed them in the living room, the hallway, and the basement steps. I wore a body camera strapped to my chest. I had a flashlight in one pocket and a small digital recorder in the other. At around 11 p.m., I heard the piano start up again, the same slow loop of notes. My heartbeat hammered in my ears. I said to myself, "Stay alert." I could feel my hands trembling. I took a deep breath and tried to stand my ground in the living room. The music grew louder, like it was calling me. My vision wavered, and I felt my knees buckle. I pressed the record button on the digital recorder. The last thing I saw was the camera feed on my phone turning to static, then darkness. I snapped awake the next morning at 7 a.m. on the floor of my bedroom. My chest camera was gone. My digital recorder was lying next to me. I picked it up and played the last recording. It was a bunch of garbled sounds plus my own voice muttering. I didn't recognize the words. It sounded like nonsense. The piano music was in the background, and it faded out after about 2 minutes. Then silence. I decided I'd had enough. I started packing. I called a friend who owns a construction business. I told him I'd pay him extra if he'd handle the renovations without me living on site. I grabbed my bags and locked up the mansion. I drove away, feeling my shoulders relax for the first time in days. I still need to figure out how to sell that place or at least fix it enough to offload it. But I know I can't stay there anymore. Every time I think about those missing hours, my stomach knots up. I don't know what caused that piano music, and I'm not sure I want to find out. For now, I'm back in my cramped apartment trying to move on. I'll let someone else deal with the basement. I just hope they have better luck than I did. I remember the night it all started. I was sitting in my ranger station, flipping through old log entries trying to stay awake until my next round. The air outside felt heavy, and the wind barely moved the treetops. I kept staring at the clock, waiting for midnight so I could get on with my patrol. At the time, I just thought it was another quiet shift. I had no clue what was waiting for me out there. I grabbed my flashlight, slung my backpack over my shoulders, and headed out onto the dirt trail. The forest around me was dark and still. I could hear distant crickets and the occasional rustling in the undergrowth, probably a fox or a raccoon. The ground felt damp under my boots because it had rained a few days earlier. My breath turned visible in the cool air. I walked along the main path, checking for any fallen branches or signs of illegal activity. Sometimes people came out here to dump trash or light fires. I was used to dealing with that. I wasn't prepared for what I actually found. During that first night, I didn't see the thing right away. I just sensed something watching me. I spun around with my flashlight, but everything looked normal. I stood there, shining the beam across the trees, searching for any shape that didn't belong. All I saw were thin trunks and low brush. I heard a small snap somewhere off to my right, like a twig breaking under pressure. I aimed my light that way, but the darkness seemed thicker than usual. My heart started beating faster. I stepped toward the noise, but I couldn't see anything. After a minute or so of standing there, I decided to keep moving. I told myself it was nothing. Over the next few nights, I felt like that presence was getting closer. My chest would tighten when I turned corners on the trail. Sometimes I spotted a long, dark shape out of the corner of my eye slipping behind a tree. Other times I noticed a shift in the shadows just outside my flashlight's range. The shadows seemed to move on their own. I would stand absolutely still, straining my ears for sounds of breathing or footsteps. I didn't hear anything, but I knew something was there. One night, I reached a section of the forest that always felt a bit off. There were dead patches of grass and a few smaller trees with rotting bark. I never liked going through that spot, but my job required me to check every trail. The ground had this unpleasant smell, like old compost or stagnant water. My boots sank into the soft earth. The tree trunks were discolored with an ashy tone that made me uneasy. As I walked deeper into that area, my flashlight started flickering. That was new. I smacked it a couple of times, assuming the batteries were dying, but they were fresh. The beam kept going in and out, flashing bright 1 second and dim the next. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time. It was shaped like a tall person, but made of something blacker than the darkness around it. I couldn't see any features on it. No face, no eyes, no clothes. It looked like it was carved from a void. It stood there, about 30 feet away. It didn't move. I froze. My pulse hammered in my ears. My palms got sweaty and my throat went dry. I pointed my flashlight right at it, but the creature seemed to swallow the light. The beam didn't illuminate it at all. Then, in one smooth motion, it slipped behind a dead tree. I walked forward, heart pounding, but when I reached that spot, I found nothing. I checked behind the trunk and even looked up into the branches, but it was gone. I almost radioed in for backup, but something held me back. I think I was afraid I'd sound crazy. Over the following week, I kept encountering that shadow figure. Each time it got closer, like it was testing the boundary between us. I started noticing changes in the areas where it appeared. The vegetation looked sick. The leaves were brittle or discolored. The soil felt cold even on warmer nights. I also felt this odd pressure in my ears, like I was climbing in altitude every time I got near it. The creature itself was never in the same shape twice. Sometimes it seemed longer, like it had elongated arms. Other times it looked wider, as if 2 or 3 shapes were merging into one. Whenever I tried to shine my flashlight on it, the light faded or flickered and the shape would slip away. One night I decided to follow it. I was tired of feeling scared and curious all the time. I wanted answers. I waited until I saw it at the edge of my vision. Then I turned off my flashlight and crept after it, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight. The forest floor crackled under my boots, and every noise I made sounded too loud in my ears. The shape moved between trees like it weighed nothing, leaving no sound and no tracks. I lost it a few times in the darkness, but it always reappeared ahead of me, standing still, as if waiting for me to catch up. It led me to a clearing I had never visited before. The grass was dead, and the ground was covered in a thin layer of gray dust. A few trees at the edge were leaning over like they were on the verge of collapsing. Their bark looked rotted, and some had strips peeling off. The air smelled foul, like chemicals. My eyes stung. The shadow figure stood in the middle of that clearing, then extended an arm, or something that looked like an arm, toward the far end, where there was a cluster of thick, twisted bushes. Then it dissolved into the darkness. I walked to those bushes and saw the remains of a plastic barrel hidden behind them. The barrel was battered. There was a large split on one side, and a dark fluid had leaked out, staining the ground. I didn't recognize the label, but I saw a chemical hazard symbol. I realized that this might be the source of the contamination. The earth around the barrel looked slimy and charred. like the fluid had burned through the soil. I felt a wave of anger and unease. Someone had dumped this toxic substance here, and it was killing this corner of the forest. I stood there for a while, trying to figure out what to do. The stench made my stomach turn, and I had to cover my mouth and nose with my sleeve to keep from gagging. I wanted to call my supervisor, but it was late, and my phone signal was weak. I decided to mark the coordinates on my phone and head back to the station. As I turned around, I saw a trace of movement among the dead trees. The shadow figure was there again, watching from a distance. I had this feeling that it wanted me to do something about the barrel. I nodded at it, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and dread, and walked away. Over the next few days, I reported the barrel to my superiors. A cleanup team was arranged, and they came out to investigate. They wore protective suits, took soil samples, and started planning a safe removal of the toxic material. I offered to guide them to the exact spot, but they said they had the coordinates and would handle it. I felt uneasy about letting them go alone, but they insisted on using their own protocols. I told myself everything would be fine. Meanwhile, during my patrols, the shadow creature continued to appear. Its size increased. It loomed taller than before, and sometimes it seemed to have more limbs or angles than I could track. It never attacked me. It just watched. Whenever I walked through an area that looked unhealthy, a place with dead trees or strange withered plants, there it was. Each time I felt my adrenaline spike. My hands would grip my flashlight until my knuckles went white. My breathing got shallow. I think it sensed my tension, but I couldn't help it. That thing made my skin crawl. One evening, I decided to follow it again. The cleanup team had already taken away the barrel, but the forest was still in bad shape. I wanted to see if the creature would guide me to another spot. Sure enough, I saw it near a cluster of pines that looked half dead. Some pines were missing large patches of needles. Others had brown streaks running down their trunks. The ground there felt spongy underfoot, and I noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud. The shape slipped away between the trees, so I hurried after it. My boots sank into the wet soil, and the smell of decay was strong. We ended up at another hidden site. This time, it wasn't just one barrel. There were 4 or 5, mostly rusted. One had a leak. The fluid was dripping onto the ground, forming a thick puddle. The shadow figure stood beside them, towering over the barrels, its head almost grazing the lower branches of the nearest tree. I pulled out my phone and took pictures. My hands trembled, and the phone felt slippery in my grip. My heart was thumping like crazy. I felt sick to my stomach. Someone was systematically poisoning parts of the forest. I started making calls right there. I left messages for my supervisor, for the environmental agency, for anyone I could think of. My voice shook, and I kept swallowing hard to clear the tightness in my throat. I reported the location and asked them to send another team. The shadow figure didn't move. It just stood there. The air around it felt colder, and I felt goosebumps on my arms. My breath came out in quick puffs. When I finished, I started backing away. I didn't want to stick around that toxic puddle longer than necessary. I felt the back of my shirt clinging to my skin, damp with sweat. As I reached a safe distance, the creature finally dissolved into the darkness again. I exhaled in relief. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my flashlight. I hurried back to the station, looking over my shoulder every few steps. In the days that followed, more cleanup crews arrived. They began searching the forest for any other illegal dumping sites. I volunteered to help. I showed them the worst areas, the ones I'd seen with dead plants and strange discoloration in the soil. Each time we found something, I felt the presence of that shadow figure nearby. Sometimes I caught a glimpse of it at the corner of my eye. Other times I felt an odd chill on my neck, like it was standing right behind me. A few of my coworkers noticed my unease, but I never told them the whole story. I just said I had a bad feeling. After a while, the biggest cleanup operation started. They brought in trucks and a small team of environmental specialists who quarantined the worst patches. They wore masks and thick gloves. They put up warning signs. They dug out contaminated soil. The smell was awful, and the work was slow. I stuck around to support them. I helped carry equipment and took notes on the locations. I didn't see the shadow figure for a few days after that. I thought maybe it had served its purpose. Then, on one of my late-night patrols, I spotted it again. It was near the main trail, not far from the old ranger station. At first, I froze. I felt a wave of familiar dread. My heartbeat sped up. I wiped my sweaty hands on my pants and forced myself to walk closer. The figure looked bigger than ever, towering over the path. The moonlight filtered through the trees, and its outline seemed sharper this time. I could almost see ridges or edges along its form. A static-like crackle filled my ears. I felt pressure in my sinuses. I stopped a few feet away. My mind spun with a mix of fear and curiosity. It raised one arm and pointed down the trail. I hesitated for a second, not sure if I should follow. My stomach nodded. My instincts told me this might be a final warning, but I forced myself to move. I walked in the direction it indicated, feeling a growing sense of dread. My flashlight flickered again, forcing me to tap it a few times until it stabilized. The path led to a spot near a dried-out creek bed. The land around it looked scarred, with patches of blackened soil and leafless shrubs. I didn't see any more barrels. I saw lumps of something buried in the ground, wrapped in plastic. There was a strong smell that burned my nostrils. The shadow figure waited until I got close, then faded into the background. I reached one of the lumps and peeled back the plastic. It was filled with some kind of crystals or pellets. I couldn't identify them, but they smelled chemical. My pulse pounded, and I felt a rush of anger. More illegal waste, hidden away. I snapped a few photos and made more calls. This time I had signal issues, so I hiked back a bit until my phone connected. Eventually I reached the right people and told them exactly where to look. That night, I felt like I was on autopilot. My body was so tense that my shoulders ached. My legs felt wobbly and I stumbled a couple of times on the trail. The next morning, a group of officials arrived. They brought specialized gear, loaded the buried materials onto trucks, and cordoned off the creek bed. They said it would take weeks or months to restore the area. I watched them work, feeling drained. My mind kept going back to that shadow creature. Part of me wondered what it really was. Another part just felt thankful it led me to those sites. It appeared whenever the forest was in the worst condition, guiding me like it wanted me to fix it. I returned to my usual rounds after that, but I remained on edge. Each time I walked through the dark, I half expected to see that shape again. I carried an extra flashlight, fresh batteries, and a phone with better signal coverage. I refused to let my guard down. For several nights, I didn't see anything unusual. The forest was quiet. I still felt uneasy in those damaged spots, but no new problems popped up. It seemed that the cleanup had finally started making a difference. On my last patrol before a scheduled day off, I lingered near the main trail, scanning the trees with my flashlight. There was a slight breeze rustling the leaves, and the sky was clear. Stars dotted the blackness overhead. I thought about that creature and waited. My heart beat steadily, and my breathing felt calm for once. But nothing happened. I stayed out an hour longer than necessary, checking each area where I had seen the figure. The air felt normal, and the trees were quiet. I heard the usual night sounds: an owl hooting, small animals scurrying around. No flickering shadows. No strange shapes. I felt relieved and a little sad at the same time. I eventually headed back to the station, turned in my paperwork, and locked up for the night. My shift was over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had ended. Maybe that shadowy presence had gone now that we were fixing the damage. Maybe I'd never see it again. I can't say I missed the fear, but a part of me felt connected to it, like it was a silent ally guiding me. I went home, made a simple dinner, and tried to sleep. My mind replayed the moments of tension, the flickering flashlights, the cold pressure on my skin, the quiet guidance from something I still can't explain. I didn't have nightmares that night, though. I actually slept through until morning. When I woke up, the sun was shining and I felt rested for the first time in weeks. That's how it happened. That's how I discovered illegal dumping sites and helped prevent more harm to my forest. That's how I ended up chasing a shadow creature made of pure darkness, only to find out it wasn't hunting me at all. It was showing me what needed to be done. I never told my coworkers about the shape. I don't think they'd believe me. But I know what I saw, and I know where it led me. Now, every time I step onto those trails at night, I still keep an eye out, just in case I see it again. I don't know if I'll ever get an explanation, but I do know that the forest is starting to heal, and for now, that's enough. I stepped into the abandoned theater on a warm Wednesday night. I remember the stale smell of dust and mold in the lobby. The caretaker had given me the keys and said he didn't want to stick around. He said the place gave him a headache. I didn't argue with him. I just thanked him, watched him leave, and turned on my flashlight. My name is Mark, and I specialize in acoustics. I've spent over a decade working in concert halls, arenas, and old buildings with complicated echo patterns. I've seen some strange rooms and tested bizarre materials, but I've never felt anything like I did in that theater. I walked through the entrance and aimed my flashlight at the peeling wallpaper. The pattern looked like some outdated floral design, but it was hard to make out the details through all the grime. My nose itched from the dust. My boots left faint tracks on the dirty floor. I heard my own breathing echo back at me, which felt unusual. Normally, large open spaces have a certain reverberation, but here it sounded flat yet somehow prolonged, like the air absorbed part of the sound and then spat out the rest. I headed into the main auditorium. My beam of light showed row after row of ripped chairs. They might have been plush at one point, but now they were torn and discolored. In the corner, near the old stage, I saw a few cables and a small pile of broken wood. It looked like someone had tried to fix something but gave up halfway. I walked closer, stepping over debris, and looked at the stage. The curtains were still there, though they hung unevenly. One side drooped more than the other, and the once red fabric was a dull brownish color. I set down my equipment case near the edge of the stage. I opened it and pulled out my portable sound recorder, a directional microphone, and a set of frequency analyzers. My job was to figure out why strange noises had been reported in this place. The caretaker mentioned hearing disembodied voices or faint music, but he said it never sounded like it was coming from inside the building. Instead, it seemed like it was bleeding through the walls from somewhere else. That idea grabbed my attention right away. Most of the time, weird echoes in old buildings come from water pipes or air vents. But this caretaker insisted it wasn't that. I climbed onto the stage and set up a tripod for my microphone. The wooden boards felt uneven under my feet. I tested each step, not wanting to fall through any rotten sections. The spotlight area still had some overhead lights, but they were cracked and probably dead. I connected my microphone to a small audio interface and powered it with a portable battery. I started recording ambient sound. At first, I only heard my own movements, the scrape of my boot sole, the rustle of my jacket, my steady breathing. But then, about 20 seconds in, I picked up something faint. It was a murmur, like a distant conversation in another room. I stopped moving and held my breath. I stood still, letting the microphone collect whatever it could. My heart pounded a bit because it didn't make sense. I was alone in this place. I glanced around with the flashlight, but the seats in the empty aisles stared back at me. Nothing moved. I replayed that segment on my headphones. It sounded like 2 or 3 people speaking, but I couldn't make out the language. It was too soft and unclear. I put on my over-ear headphones and walked around the stage, searching for a sweet spot. The caretaker's notes said the sounds were strongest near the center. I found a spot where the floor squeaked under my weight. I planted my microphone there. I turned up the gain on my recorder, keeping an eye on the levels. The background noise in the room stayed consistent, but after a while, I caught a small spike. I felt a chill on the back of my neck. It felt like I was being watched, but I told myself it was just my nerves reacting to the odd acoustics. Suddenly, I heard a faint melody. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, like someone strumming a harp or some unusual string instrument. I didn't know how to classify it immediately. I listened back and heard it again in the recording, but it was more like a brief chord that didn't match any pattern I recognized. My hands felt clammy as I adjusted the microphone direction. The chord repeated, but shifted in pitch each time. It wasn't random noise from outside because it had structure, like it belonged to a real piece of music. I felt my chest tighten from excitement and a bit of fear. This was the most interesting auditory anomaly I'd encountered. I carried my gear upstage and then down into the orchestra pit. The pit smelled worse, like wet wood and old paint. My flashlight revealed a few broken instruments, an abandoned drum, a cracked cello. I set up a second microphone there, facing the seats. When I turned on the recorder, the same chord appeared again, but this time I heard it more clearly. It sounded closer, like someone was just a few feet away plucking strings. I looked around the pit. Nothing. The sound wasn't in the physical space, but it was definitely hitting the microphone. I kept recording for half an hour. During that time, the sound got stronger. Occasionally I heard faint voices that seemed to argue, though I couldn't recognize the words. There were soft footsteps that didn't match mine. The footsteps sounded like heavy shoes on a wooden floor, but nobody was in the building except me. At one point, I felt a slight vibration under my feet, like a subsonic wave pushing up through the floorboards. My stomach churned. I swallowed hard and tried to steady my breathing. I paused the recording and ran a quick analysis on my laptop. I saw a cluster of frequencies that fell outside the normal range for typical room resonance. The wave patterns didn't match what I'd expect in an old theater. It was as if the building was resonating with something not generated inside it. Then, there was a moment where the software glitched. My screen went black for a second. When it came back, the wave patterns had spiked to an impossible level, then leveled out again. I decided I needed to test some sweeps. I set up a frequency generator to sweep through low bass up to high treble. I wanted to see if anything triggered a specific reaction from the environment. I stood near the stage, holding my headphones in one hand and my flashlight in the other. I started the sweep. At first, I didn't hear anything unusual, but around 120 hertz, there was a heavy rumble that made my eardrums vibrate. I felt my chest tighten, and a wave of nausea hit me. I heard a scraping sound somewhere backstage. It made my heart jump. I flicked my flashlight beam toward the backstage area, but I didn't see anything. I increased the frequency. Around 210 hertz, the entire auditorium seemed to hum. The seats rattled. The sound had a strange pulsing quality. My breath caught in my throat, and I noticed my hand was shaking slightly. I shifted the frequency upward to the mid-range. Then I heard a voice in my headphones, crisp, like it was whispering right into the microphone. It said something, but it wasn't in English. The tone was urgent. I froze. My heart pounded like a hammer in my chest. The voice repeated the phrase, and then it cut out. I pulled off my headphones and listened to the empty theater. Silence, aside from my own breathing. I replayed it. The voice sounded calm but insistent. I couldn't decode the words. They sounded like they came from somewhere else entirely, like a radio signal from another station bleeding into mine. My pulse raced, and my hands felt damp with sweat. I felt a strong urge to leave, but I also felt like I was on the brink of a discovery. I've spent years analyzing sound, and I never found anything that defied all logic like this. I decided to keep going. I put on my headphones again, this time turning up the volume a bit more. Around 420 hertz, I heard a loud pop. My microphone levels spiked, and the hair on my arms stood up. That's when I noticed a distortion in the air near the stage. It looked like the air was shimmering or rippling. It reminded me of heat waves rising off pavement, except there was no heat source. I took a few steps forward. My stomach twisted with anxiety, and my breathing got shallow. I pointed my flashlight at it. The beam didn't reveal much, just the same warped space. But my instincts were screaming at me to back away. The pop repeated, and the shimmering got more intense. I heard that strange chord again, but louder. It sounded like it was coming from right in front of me. The stage boards creaked. My legs felt weak. I wondered if I should call for help, but then I reminded myself that I was just scanning frequencies in an old theater. I should keep my head clear. I started recording video on my phone just to document the moment. I held the phone with one hand and kept my flashlight trained on the distortion. I saw a brief flash, like a camera flash, but more localized. Then the air in front of me looked like it tore open in a small circular shape. My mind told me this couldn't be real. I moved closer, out of pure curiosity. My heart pounded like I'd run a marathon. Inside that circle, I could see a dark space. I realized I was shaking so hard I had to force my breath to slow down. My mind ran through all sorts of logical explanations. Maybe a reflection, maybe some trick with the lights, maybe my device malfunctioning. But then I heard a voice again. It was the same voice I'd picked up on the recording, except now it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around. Nothing was there. I heard another voice, more distant, like someone else was calling from deeper inside that dark space. My flashlight beam didn't penetrate the blackness. I leaned forward, my pulse throbbing in my ears. Then the shimmering closed. It snapped shut, leaving the stage as it was before, with only the dusty boards and the drooping curtain. I tried to catch my breath. I turned off the frequency generator and listened. The voices were gone. The cord was gone. Just silence. I hurried to my laptop. My hands were shaking when I tried to check the audio data. I saw a spike in the readings around the moment I saw the shimmering open. The frequency hit a range I'd never recorded before, something well beyond what standard acoustic equipment should detect. My laptop's software displayed bizarre waveforms. It was as if the signal came from a different realm of physics. My mind was spinning, but I forced myself to keep going. I switched to a manual input mode and tried to replicate the frequency. Part of me thought it was a bad idea, but curiosity outweighed my fear. I played with the controls, inching the frequency generator closer to the peak I'd seen on the readings. The theater felt tense, like the air was heavier. My shoulders felt tight and my head started throbbing. I switched back and forth between different wave shapes. Then, at one precise setting, I saw the stage ripple again. The chord returned louder than ever. My eyes watered from the intensity of the sound. I could almost feel it pressing on my chest. The circle started to form again, that same swirling darkness. My breathing turned shallow and my legs trembled. I didn't know what I was opening, but something was definitely happening. Then I heard footsteps. They came from the left side of the stage, near the old storage closet. It sounded like someone was walking slowly toward me. I pointed my flashlight in that direction, but saw no one. The footsteps got louder. My throat went dry. I took a few steps back. I felt sweat drip down my forehead. The footsteps stopped, and then there was a soft knocking sound. It came from behind the stage backdrop. I looked at the shimmering opening. It flickered, almost like it was reacting to the sounds around it. I realized, with a jolt of adrenaline, that something on the other side was aware of me. My heart pounded. I felt like the theater was closing in on me. Every creak in the floor, every shift in the air made me flinch. The shimmer in front of me pulsed in time with the chord. I heard a distant conversation in a language I couldn't identify, and it sounded like it was coming closer. I shut down the frequency generator. The shimmer flickered and gradually vanished. The voices faded, but I could still hear them in my headphones for a few more seconds, as if they were disappointed that I'd cut off the power. I backed away from the stage. My feet hit a fallen prop and I nearly tripped. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. I realized I needed to leave and figure out a plan. I had recordings, wave data, and some experience that told me I wasn't dealing with standard acoustic phenomena. My mind raced. I thought about telling someone, maybe a fellow acoustics expert or a physics professor, but I knew they would doubt my sanity if I explained this without evidence. Luckily, I had recordings, but I wasn't sure how well they would capture that shimmer or the voices. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, keeping one ear open for any sign that the portal or whatever it was might open again. The building felt different, like it was charged with static electricity. My hair stood on end and I kept expecting to see a shape in the corners of my vision. I stuffed my microphones, cables, and recorder into my case. Then I folded my tripod and slung my laptop bag over my shoulder. Before I left the stage, I took one last look at the spot where I'd seen the portal form. It was just empty air now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was right there, lurking, waiting for me to try the right frequency again. I left the theater around midnight. Outside, the air felt thick, and the parking lot was nearly pitch black. I fumbled for my car keys. My hands were shaky, and I felt a strange tingling in my arms, like the energy in that place hadn't fully left me. I opened my car door and slid behind the wheel. My mind replayed the moment the portal opened. I could still feel the pressure on my chest from the sound waves. I could still hear the voices. Something out there had noticed me. I felt certain of that. As I started the engine, I wondered if I should ever return to that building. Part of me felt terrified by what I'd experienced. Another part of me felt drawn to it, like I'd discovered something groundbreaking that nobody else had ever touched. My heart was still pounding, and my palms were sweaty against the steering wheel. I took a deep breath, tried to calm myself, and pulled out of the parking lot. I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked tense, eyes wide, sweat on my brow. I told myself I'd review the data at home and see if any of it made sense in the morning. But deep down, I knew I'd stumbled onto something more than an acoustic oddity. I'd opened a doorway to another place. I wasn't sure who or what was on the other side, but I was certain they'd heard me, and they'd recognized my presence. As I drove away from the abandoned theater, I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I wondered if I'd be able to sleep, or if I'd keep hearing that chord echoing in my mind. I wondered if the next time I powered up my equipment, I'd feel that vibration again, and see the air ripple and tear. And I wondered if one day, something might cross over all the way, looking for me. I pulled up to the old building just before noon. The walls looked worn and the windows seemed ready to cave in. The street was quiet, and I could hear my own breathing. I parked my car right next to a fire hydrant. It felt like nobody cared about parking laws in this part of town anymore. I grabbed my camera bag and walked toward the main entrance, which had large double doors with broken hinges. I felt a sudden chill on my neck. The air inside smelled like dust and mold. My shoes left prints in the thin layer of grime on the marble floor. That was the first time I realized I might be stepping into something bigger than a standard photo shoot. I'm a photographer. I specialize in old buildings that most people have forgotten. Sometimes realtors hire me to create glossy booklets. Other times historians want detailed images of architectural elements. My job usually involves tripods, wide-angle lenses, and hours of searching for decent light in cramped or dim spaces. People think it's all about artistry, but I spend most of my time moving debris or adjusting angles so I don't capture piles of trash. Still, I love it. I get to see places most folks never visit. That day I was there to photograph the interior details of a once grand hotel. It had a large lobby with a vaulted ceiling. Some columns still stood, although a few were cracked. I stood in the center of the lobby, turning my head slowly, noting the interplay of shadows on the walls. The entire space felt oddly dense, like walking through thick air. I ignored that sensation and took out my camera. I set up my tripod near the collapsed front desk. I framed my first shot, focusing on an ornate railing that ran along the second-floor balcony. When I pressed the shutter, my camera's click echoed against the marble surfaces. I took a few more shots from the same angle, adjusting the aperture to see if I could capture more detail in the shadows. Then I looked through the camera's viewfinder to review the images. Something appeared off. I saw pale outlines behind the railing, shapes that looked like people. I thought maybe it was dust in the lens or some light flare. I zoomed in on the camera's small screen. The shapes had faint faces. They looked like they were going about their day, leaning on the railing, pointing at something below. My hands grew sweaty, and my heart pounded. I wiped my lens and took the same shot again. The shapes were still there. I stepped back from the camera. I walked around, trying to see if there was some reflection or maybe a piece of glass that could have caused that effect. I found nothing but broken tiles and scattered bits of plaster. My mind started racing with possibilities. I didn't believe in ghosts, I always thought most supernatural things could be explained by lighting or old wiring or some glitch in the camera, but I felt a tightness in my stomach. My pulse was high, and I realized my breathing was shallow. I decided to check the second-floor balcony. Maybe there was an actual person up there messing with me. The stairs creaked under my weight. I tried to shine my flashlight around each corner. I found torn wallpaper, rusted handrails, and a bunch of crumpled soda cans that must have been left by squatters. My footsteps sounded loud, like I was the only living thing in that entire building. I reached the railing and looked down into the lobby. It was empty. I felt a buzzing in my ears like my own pulse was thrumming. The air felt cold, even though it was supposed to be a warm day outside. I went back downstairs and decided to continue with my shoot. I told myself that the shapes I saw were probably a camera malfunction. I moved to a long corridor behind the main lobby. The floor was covered in old carpet. It squished under my boots, soaked with some kind of moisture that leaked from the ceiling. The corridor led to what used to be a dining area. There was a cluster of round tables and chairs stacked in the corner. Large windows let in a hazy light that revealed floating particles of dust. I set up my camera again. This time I focused on a cluster of cracked chairs. I was adjusting the ISO when I heard a sound behind me, like shoes scraping on the carpet. I spun around, aiming my flashlight. Nobody was there. I waited a few seconds, listening. I only heard my own breathing. I took another series of shots, then checked the camera screen. In those photos, I saw at least 3 figures around the tables. Their clothing looked dated, maybe from the 1940s or 1950s. One of them seemed to be carrying a tray. Another had a notebook in hand. They looked busy, like they were working in a restaurant. My heart started thumping harder than before. I felt clammy. My mouth went dry. I took a step back and almost knocked over my tripod. I caught it before it crashed to the floor. My arms trembled. I told myself to get a grip, but the more I looked at those images, the more they seemed real. I started to think something was happening in this building that I had never experienced before. I walked around taking pictures of random corners, pillars, and doorways, trying to see if the phenomenon would repeat. Each time I caught glimpses of these translucent figures. Some looked like they were from a much earlier era, maybe the late 1800s, wearing vests or long dresses. Others looked more recent, perhaps from the 1970s with bright shirts. They overlapped in the same frame, all in different poses as if they occupied the same space in different moments. After about an hour, I found myself sitting on a broken bench in the lobby. My hands shook as I flipped through the camera's preview. I felt a tightness in my chest. I didn't know what to do with this discovery. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but I also felt a strange pull to figure out what was happening. This wasn't normal. It wasn't just random paranormal activity. It looked organized, as if they were performing a process. Several figures had their arms extended toward a central point in the lobby. Others seemed to be walking in circles in the hallway. 1 or 2 were positioned near the entrance, almost like guards. I swallowed hard. My throat felt dry, so I grabbed a water bottle from my bag and chugged it. My camera battery was half depleted from all the shots I took. I decided to explore the basement. Buildings like this usually have interesting mechanical rooms and storage areas that might explain something. Old blueprints, logs, or something that would help me understand the building's history. I found a narrow staircase near the back. The steps were made of concrete and had cracks. The smell grew more intense down there. It was damp and musty. The darkness forced me to use my flashlight the entire way. My foot slipped on a wet patch and I gripped the railing to steady myself. At the bottom, I saw a series of corridors with low ceilings. Exposed pipes and wiring ran along the walls. I stepped through puddles that made my socks damp. My flashlight beam caught a few old signs on the walls pointing to a laundry room and an employee locker area. I went into the locker room first. Rows of rusty lockers stood half open. I took a few shots. The flash from the camera lit up the room in quick bursts. Then I checked the camera. There they were again, faint figures. Some wore uniforms with name tags. One was sitting on a bench fiddling with a shoe. Another looked like he was rummaging through a locker. They moved in a loop, always the same gestures. My heart pounded in my ears. I felt a knot in my stomach. My instincts told me to leave, but I also felt like I had a chance to understand something nobody else had ever documented. I moved out of the locker room and into the laundry area. Large metal machines stood covered in rust. The floor was slippery. I almost lost my balance again. I pointed my flashlight around, searching for anything that might stand out. That's when I found a small storage closet in the corner. The door was stuck, but I shoved it hard, and it opened. Inside, I saw shelves filled with dusty notebooks, file boxes, and old ledgers. I started flipping through them, coughing from the dust. Most of it was dated from different decades, each set of records detailing repairs, staff schedules, deliveries, and unusual notes about the building. One entry caught my attention. It mentioned a maintenance schedule for the winter solstice ceremony. It appeared in multiple logs, spanning decades. The handwriting changed over time, but the phrasing stayed the same. Ensure the building remains sealed for the winter solstice ceremony. All staff must follow the tradition to preserve the spirit of the hotel. Another note said, participants must stand at appointed stations. Do not allow the memory to fade. Every decade, we restore what was lost. I felt my heart rate spike again. My hands trembled as I realized these notes could explain the repeated patterns of those figures. I heard a faint scraping noise outside the closet. My breathing grew shallow and I froze. My body tensed up. I flicked off my flashlight for a moment and stood in the dark, listening. The scraping noise stopped. I felt my chest tighten, but I forced myself to turn the flashlight back on. I stuffed a few notebooks into my camera bag and decided it was time to leave the basement. I crept back toward the stairs, staying alert for any movement. Nothing jumped out at me. I climbed back upstairs, taking 2 steps at a time. My knees felt stiff. Once I reached the ground floor, I walked straight to the main entrance. The air felt heavier than before, like the building itself was watching me. I heard a low hum in my ears, and I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or something else. I stepped out onto the street and slammed the door behind me. I felt the sun on my face. My lungs expanded with fresh air. I leaned against my car, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. Then I got inside and locked the doors. I took a moment to catch my breath. My heart was pounding against my ribs, and I could feel sweat on my forehead. Once I drove away, I headed straight to my apartment. My legs felt unsteady as I climbed the stairs to my place. I tossed my keys on the kitchen table, set my camera bag down, and booted up my computer. I transferred the photos from my memory card. I sat there, watching the progress bar on my screen, tapping my foot. As soon as I could, I opened the images. They looked even clearer on a larger monitor. The figures had sharper outlines. Some had distinctly older hairstyles and clothing. Others seemed more modern. All of them appeared focused on specific tasks. Over the next few hours, I went through the notebooks I had taken. They detailed a repeated ritual designed to preserve the hotel's essence. It seemed that every group of people who ran the place over the decades had been part of it. Each time they held a ceremony that involved standing in precise spots, reciting lines, or performing gestures. There was nothing about animal sacrifices or anything violent. It looked more like a collective effort to keep the building's history from disappearing. The notes mentioned that the hotel had some unusual design elements that allowed time to fold in on itself. These ceremonies were meant to keep that effect going, so the hotel's spirit could remain alive in some shape or form. My heart thumped in my chest as I realized that my camera had caught these moments from different points in the building's timeline. Those ghostly shapes weren't random apparitions. They were past and future participants performing their parts in a loop, all coexisting in the same space whenever I snapped a photo. I had evidence of their existence, at least in the form of these images, and I understood that they weren't trying to scare me. They were following their instructions to keep the place intact, even if the building was rotting in the present. I felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to post these photos online and see people's reactions. Another part of me thought maybe I should keep this quiet. These images showed something that regular folks wouldn't believe. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. My eyes stung from staring at the screen. My mouth felt dry again, so I got up and drank a glass of water. I could still feel the weight of the day pressing on my shoulders. I copied the photos onto an external drive. Then I called a colleague who sometimes helps me with unusual shoots. I told him I might have found something strange, and I asked if I could get a second opinion on the images. He sounded skeptical, but he agreed to drop by in the morning. I hung up the phone and sat alone in my apartment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. My mind kept replaying the images of those transparent figures. My body felt tense and jittery, and I kept clenching and unclenching my fists. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the building's corridors full of overlapping silhouettes. I felt a dull ache in my chest, and I couldn't get comfortable. Around 5 a.m., I gave up on trying to sleep and got out of bed. I opened my laptop and scrolled through the images one more time. The clarity was undeniable. The figures were there, repeating the same motions, locked in some cycle. I thought back to the logs in the basement. The mention of a winter solstice ceremony stuck in my mind. That date was coming up in a few weeks. I wondered if something would happen then. I wondered if they still needed living participants or if the ritual was now carried out by these overlapping echoes of past employees and guests. The idea made my stomach tighten. Still, I couldn't help feeling a strange sense of respect for their dedication. They had maintained that ritual for decades, maybe longer, passing it down through staff and management. Now, even after the hotel closed and fell into disrepair, they seemed determined to keep its memory alive. My photos showed them in action, continuing that process across different layers of time. When I finally stood up to stretch my legs, my back ached from sitting so long. My living room was silent except for the occasional buzz of traffic outside. I knew I had stumbled onto something extraordinary, but I also felt a sense of unease. I was part of a secret now. These photos weren't just interesting shots of an abandoned building. They were proof of some kind of time loop or communal ritual that transcended normal boundaries. I leaned against the wall, thinking about what my colleague might say when he saw the images. I wondered if I should return to the hotel. Maybe I could set up better lighting or bring more equipment. But then I thought about how the building felt, how the air seemed dense, how the corridors felt alive. My hands started shaking again. I wasn't sure if I could handle walking back in there alone. Yet I also felt an urge to document more, to see if I could capture the ritual itself on a specific date. My mind raced with possibilities, and I couldn't settle on a final decision. That's what happened. I have the photos to prove it. I don't know how to describe it any more clearly. I saw those figures with my own eyes on the camera's screen. They appeared in every shot, overlapping each other, dressed for different decades, carrying out the same tasks. And the records in the basement confirmed that this wasn't just a haunting. It was a deliberate act to preserve the memory of that old hotel. They were performing some kind of elaborate time-based ritual. I never expected to discover something like that when I woke up that morning. But I did, and now I can't unsee those images or ignore those notes. If someone asks me why I look different these days, why I seem preoccupied, it's because I'm still trying to figure out what I stumbled into. And I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of standing in that empty lobby, watching my camera reveal a truth that my eyes alone could never catch. I started driving a night shift taxi 2 years ago. I wanted the extra money, and I figured the only real challenges would be drunken passengers and maybe the occasional fare jumper. That was before I saw the thing in my rearview mirror. I'm not talking about a drunk or a stray cat. I'm talking about a living, shifting creature that changes shape every time I look at it. The first time I noticed it, I thought I was losing my mind. Now I'm sure it's real because it keeps showing up when certain passengers climb into my back seat. It never hurts me, but it seems interested in preventing those specific passengers from reaching their destination. I don't know what it is or what it wants, but I'm going to tell you everything I've seen. This might sound unbelievable, but I'm just going to lay it out. I remember that first encounter clearly. It was a Friday night, close to midnight. I was parked near a bar that always had decent tips. People were spilling onto the sidewalk, stumbling around, trying to hail rides. My windows were open because the air conditioning wasn't working. A woman waved at me, then got in. She was around her early 30s, wearing a dull gray jacket. She gave me an address in a calm, clear tone. She didn't seem drunk. She looked tired, maybe bored. I pulled away from the curb. Inside the cab, my overhead light was flickering a little. I heard a faint buzzing from the old radio under the dashboard. Everything felt normal until I glanced into my rearview mirror. At first, I thought I saw a large bird sitting in the back seat. I blinked, then I just saw the woman. She was rummaging through her purse. My heart rate picked up, but I thought maybe I was wiped from too many shifts. I took a quick breath, tried to focus on the road, and kept driving. We reached a red light. I checked the mirror again. My passenger was leaning forward, looking at her phone. Right beside her, in the seat behind me, I saw something else. It had a pointed beak, dark eyes, and feathers running along its head. It was hunched in the corner, watching the woman. I felt my body tense. My skin prickled. I turned around, hoping to catch it directly with my own eyes, but the second I looked back, I only saw an empty seat. The woman didn't notice anything. She just looked at me like I was acting weird. I smiled and turned back to the wheel. When the light changed, I got moving again. That ride ended without further incidents. The woman paid and got out near her building. She walked away, and my back seat was empty. But I was unsettled. I could still picture that bizarre shape. Feathers on top, maybe talons instead of hands. I told myself to calm down. The next night, it happened again, but with a different passenger. This time, a guy in a fancy suit climbed in. He smelled like expensive cologne. He gave me an address a short ride away, so I pulled out into the traffic. About a minute later, I felt something behind me. I mean, physically felt it, like a change in the air pressure. I glanced at the mirror. Sitting beside the suited guy was a creature with the shape of a small monkey. It had fur covering its arms and a long tail draped over the seat. It kept tilting its head to stare at him. My palms were clammy. I kept rubbing them on my pants. My chest felt tight. I tried to breathe normally, but my heart was pounding. I stole another look. The creature bared small pointed teeth and twitched its tail. Then it vanished when I turned my head around. The passenger was busy tapping on his phone. He showed no reaction. Those encounters became a regular thing, but only for certain passengers. This creature kept showing up in different animal forms. Sometimes it had reptilian scales, sometimes it had a wolf's head, sometimes it looked like a giant lizard. The worst part was how it behaved. It always watched the passenger. It never touched them or me. It just lurked and glared, sometimes shifting its position. A couple of times I saw it press its face close to them as if sniffing them. I broke out in a sweat each time. My stomach felt twisted in knots. My mouth went dry. One night I picked up a man from an office complex. He looked stressed, pacing with his phone in his hand. He got in the back. He asked to go to a late-night diner. I drove out of the parking lot. On the freeway, I noticed the creature again. This time it looked like some kind of big cat, like a panther or a jaguar. I saw sleek black fur and muscular legs. It stared at the passenger with bright yellow eyes. Then I realized something was wrong with the car. It started sputtering. The engine made a grinding noise. My steering wheel started to shake. I pulled over onto the shoulder, heart hammering. The passenger cursed and asked if the taxi was about to break down. I checked my gas and everything seemed fine. I tried to start the engine again. It roared to life like nothing was wrong. I merged back onto the freeway, but the same problem happened a minute later. I couldn't figure it out. The passenger said he might call another ride. Before he could do that, the creature's head jerked toward the gear shift in the front. I saw its ears flatten against its skull. Then, my gear shift popped out of place with a loud clunk. The engine died again. The passenger groaned. He said he would walk. We were only half a mile from an exit ramp, so he got out and started heading down the shoulder. I sat there breathing hard, sweat dripping down my forehead. I turned around and saw nothing. The back seat was empty. Then I started the car again and it was completely normal. That freaked me out. It felt like the creature had manipulated my car to keep him from reaching his destination. Over the following weeks, I noticed a pattern. The creature only appeared when I picked up someone who was tense, on edge, or suspicious in some way. A couple of times I had passengers who looked calm or happy, and I never saw the thing. But if someone climbed in looking angry or fearful, I'd see that shapeshifter. It would appear in the seat behind me in a form that matched the passenger's mood or vibe. I started expecting it. Each time I felt uneasy about a passenger, I'd glance in the mirror. Sure enough, I'd catch a glimpse of some new animal shape. And almost every time something happened that delayed or canceled that passenger's ride. One Wednesday night, a woman flagged me down outside a late-night pharmacy. She had a large bag in her hands and seemed agitated, looking over her shoulder. I asked if she was okay. She nodded and gave me an address. The moment we pulled out of the lot, I saw the creature again. It looked like a scrawny dog with matted fur and large black eyes. Its lips were pulled back, showing fangs. It made a quiet, growling sound, though I couldn't tell if my passenger heard it. She seemed more focused on her phone. Then I felt the car drift. My steering wheel felt heavier. I tried to control it, but it felt like my tires were slipping. The road wasn't wet, so I panicked. I forced the wheel to stay straight. The woman looked up and told me to be careful. I took a few slow breaths. The dog thing in the mirror opened its mouth and let out a sound that rumbled deep. I felt goosebumps. My stomach churned. My arms felt shaky. After a few long seconds, the steering returned to normal. I thought I was safe, until I reached an intersection and the car died completely. Everything shut down. Lights, engine, radio. The passenger said she couldn't be late. She jumped out and rushed across the street. I watched her vanish into the darkness. Then I tried the ignition one more time. My lights came on. Engine started. No issues at all. The creature was gone. After this kept happening, I tried to do some research. I searched online for anything about a shape-shifting presence or a strange animal figure messing with vehicles. Most results were folklore stories or fantasy tales. There was nothing that matched what I was experiencing. I thought about getting my eyes checked, but I knew I wasn't hallucinating. My heart pounded each time I saw it, and I could feel a pressure in the cab. The seats creaked sometimes, as if a solid weight sat on them. I even started leaving a small phone camera recording on the dashboard at times, but it never caught anything. The footage just showed me, my passengers, and an empty back seat. I tried telling a friend about it, another cab driver. He gave me a concerned look, then said maybe I needed more sleep. I dropped the subject. I felt alone with this problem. I started dreading picking up certain passengers. I could almost sense when they were the kind of person who would attract the creature. Sure enough, if my gut told me something was off about them, the creature showed up. Then it would cause some mechanical glitch or traffic jam or something else that forced the passenger to get out early or change their plans. Sometimes the passenger just changed their mind and canceled the trip. Every time, the shapeshifter disappeared the moment the passenger was gone. One evening, I picked up a man who was sweating and gripping a briefcase. He said he had an urgent meeting across town. I felt a heaviness the moment he got in. I glanced up. The creature was there, hunched like a giant reptile with scales and a long tail coiled around its legs. I could see its tongue flicking in and out. I heard it hiss. The passenger leaned forward and asked me to go faster. I told him I'd do my best. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I felt short of breath. The creature moved closer to him. Its tail slid across the seat. My chest felt tight. I pressed the gas pedal harder, wanting to get this over with. Suddenly, a car in front of us slammed on its brakes. I swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision. The passenger shouted, gripping the seat. I pulled over, apologizing, my pulse racing. I expected the creature to sabotage my car again, but instead, the passenger's phone rang. He picked up, had a tense conversation, and then told me to turn around and take him back where I'd picked him up. He changed his mind about the meeting. He got out, looking angry. The second he left, the creature vanished, and I drove away with no trouble. Eventually, I started feeling less afraid and more irritated. One night, I was alone in my taxi, windows down, no passengers in sight. I spoke out loud, asking if the creature could hear me. I said I didn't understand why it was doing this. Of course, I got no response, but I felt like it was out there waiting for the next passenger to step in who triggered its interest. The final straw came on a Saturday, close to 3 a.m. My shift was almost over. A man in casual clothes waved me down. He looked anxious, scanning the area. He climbed in and asked me to drive him to a motel on the other side of town. His leg kept bouncing. He couldn't sit still. Right away, I checked the mirror. The creature was there, taking the form of a large bull. It had wide horns and dark fur. It glared at the passenger and snorted. I felt sweat beading on my forehead. My foot felt heavy on the accelerator. The passenger kept checking behind us as if he expected someone to follow him. We got on a main road and I felt a jerking sensation in my steering again. I gripped the wheel and tried to keep us moving in a straight line. The man in the back got agitated, telling me to hurry. I watched the bull shape stomp around in the seat. I heard a low rumbling noise. Then the entire taxi started shaking. My engine light flickered. I clenched my teeth. The passenger began complaining, telling me to pull over so he could walk. I tried to keep going, but the bull lowered its head, its horns almost touching the guy's shoulder. I felt like the air got thicker. Then the engine sputtered and died in the middle of the road. A car behind us honked. The passenger cursed, flung the door open, and hopped out. He slammed the door, shouted something I couldn't make out, then ran off. I sat there, muscles tight, my hand shaking on the gear shift. The bull shape was gone, and the taxi started right up again. I drove home, exhausted. I parked in my usual spot, turned off the engine, and just sat there breathing. My mind was racing. I didn't want to quit my job, but this was getting too strange. I stepped out onto the street and felt the night air on my face. I glanced in the rear window. Nothing was there, just the empty back seat. But I got the sense that if I ever picked up another suspicious passenger, that creature would return. I stood there a while looking at the car, waiting to see if anything stirred. Everything stayed quiet. Now, I still drive the night shift. I keep an eye out for that presence. I've learned not to freak out when I see it. If a passenger starts acting nervous, I brace myself for the creature's appearance. It always comes, always in a different animal form. It never attacks. It just stares and waits for the right moment to mess with the ride. And every single time the passenger ends up changing their plans or getting out before we reach the destination. I can't explain it. I don't know why it chooses certain people. I don't know what it wants. It doesn't communicate. I've never heard words from it. I only sense its intentions. It's like it evaluates whether the passenger should be allowed to move forward with whatever they're doing. If it decides they shouldn't, it stops them. I don't know if it's protecting somebody or just interfering. I have no proof it exists. No recordings, no footprints, nothing. But I see it, and I feel it. Every time I catch a glimpse of those shifting shapes, I get that chill down my spine and my heartbeat goes wild. I keep driving because I need the money. I also feel like I need to see how far this goes. If the creature ever tries something else, something worse, I wonder if I'll be able to stop it. So far, it's just messing with the car, forcing people out early. But I don't know if that's the extent of its power. Sometimes I wish it would just appear when I'm alone so I could confront it. But it only ever shows up with these particular passengers. I go through each shift reminding myself to stay calm. I pick up fares, avoid eye contact if they make me uncomfortable, and try to complete the ride without any issues. Most of the time, the shapeshifter leaves me alone. But once in a while, I see something move in the back seat. Something that's not entirely human, not entirely animal, but a blend of fur, scales, or feathers. I clench the steering wheel, feel the blood pounding in my ears, and wait for the engine to stall or the passenger to bail out. Once it's over, I breathe and carry on. That's my routine now. I haven't told many people, and I doubt anyone would believe me. I don't know if I believe it myself sometimes, but I can't deny what I see. It's real to me, and it's out there, waiting to decide who gets to reach their destination and who doesn't. And so I keep driving through the night, eyes on the mirror, fingers tight on the wheel. So far, I'm still here, hoping I never see that thing turn its attention on me. I started this job because I wanted an easy paycheck. I'm not ashamed to say it. A night guard shift at a museum sounded calm, maybe even boring. I imagined myself sipping coffee at a desk, nodding off between rounds, and occasionally shining a flashlight at a locked door. That's all I expected. Nothing prepared me for what actually happened. I still feel uneasy even thinking about it. But I need to get it off my chest, so I'll just say it straight. The portraits in that museum moved when I wasn't watching them, and they weren't just shifting for no reason. My name's Chris. I'm 35. I took the job because it had decent pay, health benefits, and it was close to my apartment. The museum itself is in a quiet neighborhood. It's a 3-story building with tall windows, white columns in the front, and a side entrance for employees. Inside, there are long halls with marble floors and these heavy wooden doors leading to different wings. The artwork spans from medieval times to contemporary pieces, but most of my shift revolves around the older section on the second floor. That's where the trouble started. My first few nights were quiet. The routine was simple. I'd clock in at 10 p.m., take a quick tour of the museum, make sure all doors were locked, then sit in the security office and watch the cameras. Once every hour, I'd walk the same route, scanning each corridor with my flashlight. It felt normal. The only thing that got to me was the silence. At night, that place feels empty and still, except for the buzz of old light fixtures or the echo of my footsteps. After 2 nights, I knew the layout well. I knew how the hallways turned, where the paintings hung, and which corners felt darker than the rest. On my 3rd night, something changed. It wasn't dramatic at first. I remember standing in front of this old portrait of a man in a red coat. The plaque said he was some colonial figure, an explorer or a merchant. In the painting, he had a firm posture, shoulders back, one hand resting on a map, the other holding the hilt of a sword. His eyes looked forward, slightly to the right. I'd seen it 100 times by then. But that night, as I was about to turn away, I got this feeling like someone was watching me. It sounds cliché, but I swear it was real. I spun around. The portrait's eyes seemed to meet mine. I felt my breath catch. I told myself I was being paranoid and walked on, but my heart was pounding in my ears. The next night, I checked that same portrait again. This time, the man's stance looked off. I couldn't be sure if I was imagining it, but I thought his shoulders were angled a bit more toward me, like he'd moved half an inch. I leaned in close, studying the brush strokes. I didn't see any cracks or weird signs of tampering. I stepped back, shook my head, and told myself it was just my memory playing tricks. Then I moved on, feeling a chill on my arms. 2 hours later, I returned on my next round. The painting seemed normal again. The man was facing forward like before. But something else was different. Another portrait, a woman with a bonnet, stood across the room. She was supposed to be looking straight ahead. Instead, her gaze was aimed to the left. I felt my heart hammer. I approached the painting, shining my flashlight at it. The woman's painted eyes looked toward the corner of the frame. I double-checked the plaque's picture on the wall, a smaller version for reference. The printed image showed her eyes pointed forward. My stomach tightened. That was the moment I realized it wasn't just in my head. I decided not to mention it to my supervisor. I was new, and I figured nobody would believe me. So I kept it to myself for a while. I tried to ignore it, but each night more paintings changed. Sometimes a figure that was supposed to be sitting down looked like they were standing. Another time, I found a painting where the background color shifted from dark green to a dull gray. It didn't make sense. There was no sign of tampering. The security footage in the office didn't show anyone messing with them. It was just me, a bunch of locked doors, and these paintings that wouldn't stay put. After a week, the changes got bigger. I started to notice a pattern. Certain portraits were shifting toward each other. If there were 5 people in a painting, sometimes I'd see 3 of them turn toward the hallway, and 2 turned in another direction. It was like they were cooperating. The strangest part was that these figures seemed to be recreating a single scene. I recognized some gestures. A raised arm here, a pointed finger there, people in uniform standing in formation. I remembered reading something about an incident in history involving these specific figures. The details weren't fresh in my mind, but I knew I'd seen references in the plaques or maybe in some notes around the museum. Curiosity got the best of me. During my break, I used the museum's small library in the back office. It had a few books on the major art pieces. I flipped through pages until I found a reference to a collection of colonial portraits that depicted a secret meeting. That meeting supposedly sparked a dangerous event, an attempted takeover of some local council hall centuries ago. The text described how a group of merchants, officials, and soldiers gathered at night to plan an attack on the city's trade routes. It led to unrest, but the records didn't say much else. I didn't see anything mentioning injuries or casualties. It just said it caused chaos in the region. The museum's collection apparently had a few paintings from that era, each featuring one of the people involved. That's when I realized that each portrait I'd been watching was part of that group. It clicked in my head that maybe these figures were trying to reenact that meeting. I didn't know how or why, but everything pointed to it. The paintings were lined up in the hallway in chronological order, and every time I walked past them, they seemed closer to matching the positions described in the old text. My chest felt tight when I thought about it. I had no explanation, but I saw it happen. Nobody else was around to confirm it, and I felt like I was losing my mind. One night, about 2 weeks into my job, I decided to do something drastic. I wanted proof. I brought a cheap digital camera from home. I planned to take photos of the paintings at the start of my shift and again at the end. I wanted to see if the pictures revealed any changes. I stood in front of the portrait of the man in the red coat, snapped a picture, moved on, and did the same for all the others in that corridor. My hands were sweating. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the paintings to shift right there in front of me. I felt my stomach clench each time I clicked the shutter. It was late, and the overhead lights flickered sometimes. The building's heating system would hiss and I'd jump, thinking it was something else. Around 3 a.m., I pulled up the photos on the small screen of the camera. The difference was obvious in a couple of shots. A figure that was facing left in the first picture was facing right in the second. Another painting's background changed shade, but the images were a little blurry, and I didn't have a tripod or anything. Still, I had enough to confirm what I saw with my own eyes. These pieces were shifting. I wanted to act calmly, so I stored the camera in my locker and waited until morning. My shift ended at 6 a.m. I approached my boss right before I clocked out. I tried to sound casual and said, "Have you ever noticed anything strange with the paintings in the second floor wing?" She looked at me like I'd said the dumbest thing in the world. She shook her head, told me everything was normal, and mentioned that the museum hadn't had vandalism in years. I decided not to push it. I only had a couple of weeks on the job. I thanked her and left. Over the next few nights, the changes kept progressing. I swear I saw the man in the red coat walk right out of his painting in my peripheral vision. But when I spun around, the painting just showed him standing there. A couple of the other portraits seemed to gather at the end of the hall, as if facing the double doors that led to the old archives. My pulse was racing every time I made my rounds. I couldn't sleep during the day because my mind was full of images of those shifting figures. I kept telling myself I had a responsibility to figure out what they wanted. It felt like they were calling me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. By the end of the third week, I noticed that most of the paintings in that section had rearranged themselves in a sequence. If I walked from one end of the hall to the other, I could see each figure turned at specific angles, almost forming a path that led to a locked door near the archives. I had the key, but that area was usually off limits to night staff except for emergencies. I waited until 2 a.m. when the building was at its darkest. Then I used my key and opened that door. I stepped in, flicked on the light, and saw rows of old documents, stacked paintings, and some crates. I felt a tightness in my throat. I looked around, shining my flashlight in the corners. I saw an old painting leaning against the far wall. It didn't have a label. The canvas was cracked and the frame looked worn. It showed a large table in some candlelit room with several people around it, including the man in the red coat, the woman in the bonnet, and a few others. They were signing a document. My heart thumped. I recognized the entire group from the hallway. The scene felt tense, like they were on the verge of something big. I heard a low, creaking sound behind me. I spun around, gripping my flashlight. Nothing moved, but I sensed something watching me. My palms were slick with sweat. My mouth felt dry. I walked over to the painting and lifted it carefully, setting it upright under the light. A date was scrawled in the bottom corner, 1762. I remembered reading that the incident in question took place in 1762. It matched. I looked closer and I saw what looked like an official seal in the center. It reminded me of a local crest from the city archives. That crest was used back then for official documents that authorized big political moves. It hit me. These portraits, these figures, were restaging that meeting in real time. My mind reeled with the possibility that they were trying to finish something they started centuries ago. The chaos from that time had left some mark on history. I knew it was serious. I just didn't know what exactly would happen if they succeeded in recreating that scene. The documents I read said their plan caused major problems in the trade sector. The city apparently fell into disarray for a while, though it didn't detail anything like violence or disasters. But it was enough to make me worry. If the figures were moving again, maybe they wanted to spark a similar event right here in the museum. I decided I couldn't just leave it alone. I had to stop them from finishing whatever they intended to do. I stayed in that archive room for the rest of my shift, guarding the painting. My heart raced each time I heard a creak or a thump in the corridors. But the painting didn't change while I watched it. As soon as dawn approached, I locked the door and returned the key. Then I clocked out without saying much. I barely slept that day. My mind kept spinning. The following night, I arrived a bit earlier. I wanted to see if the figures in the hallway had moved closer. Sure enough, a few of them were now facing the archive's door. The tension in my chest felt like a vice. I paced in front of them, shining my flashlight. I whispered, "You're not doing this." Nobody answered, obviously. But I thought I saw a flicker in the man in the red coat's eyes. I got the strangest sensation that he understood me. The hair on my arm stood up. I went to the archive room again. The painting was still there. It looked the same at first. Then I noticed small details. One of the figures in the background, a man with a stern expression, seemed to have turned his head slightly since the night before. I remembered him facing forward before, but now he angled his face toward the left. My throat went dry. They were adjusting their positions inside this hidden painting too. I needed a plan. I wasn't going to slash the canvas or burn it. I wasn't that reckless, and I didn't want to destroy museum property. I just wanted to stop them from completing that scene. So I grabbed the painting off the floor and set it against a crate in the corner, facing the wall. I figured if they couldn't see each other, maybe they couldn't finish their arrangement. Then I stood guard. My knees felt weak and I was trembling. I didn't care. I forced myself to stay. Every time I glanced at my watch, I felt the minutes crawl. By 4 a.m., I heard a sudden scraping sound from behind me. I whirled around. The painting had shifted half an inch. It was still facing the wall, but it had moved on the floor like someone tried to slide it upright. I jumped back, feeling my pulse in my temples. My mouth went dry. I bent down, planted my hands on the frame and shoved it against the wall so it wouldn't move any farther. Then I crouched next to it, breathing hard, waiting. I kept checking the corridor outside, listening for footsteps or any sign of movement. Around 5:30 a.m., things went quiet. I peeked at the painting one more time. It hadn't budged again. The room felt stuffy, and sweat dripped down my face. My arms were tense. I leaned against a crate, staring at the door. Finally, 6 a.m. came. I locked everything up, put the painting back in the same corner, and left it facing the wall. Then I clocked out. I kept this routine for the next few nights. Each night, the hallway portraits tried to align themselves, but they didn't have that final painting to complete their scene. I made sure it stayed hidden in the archives facing away. I could feel the air in that wing turn heavier each night, like something was frustrated, but I stayed on top of it. The date on my phone said it was near the end of the month, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was some significance to that. Maybe they needed to finish by a certain date. I don't have the answer, but as the nights passed without the final painting joining them, the rest of the portraits seemed to slow their movements. By the end of the month, I didn't see any new changes. Since then, it's stayed quiet. I still work here, and I still check those corridors. I haven't seen the painting shift in a while. I keep that final piece hidden, facing the wall in the archives. Sometimes I feel it tugging on my mind, like it wants me to turn it around, but I ignore that feeling. I don't know if I stopped something real, or if I just paused it. All I know is that everything has been calm since I took that step. I haven't told my boss or my coworkers. They'd think I was crazy. I've got no proof except for the blurry photos on my camera, and those could be explained away. But I believe what I saw, and I believe that whatever happened centuries ago almost got repeated. Now, when I do my rounds at night, I still feel uneasy. I keep my flashlight steady and I don't look at the paintings for too long. If I feel them watching me, I try to focus on the exit signs, the locked doors, and the cameras overhead. Sometimes I hear faint creaks from the frames or sense a subtle shift in the air, but I don't let it rattle me. At least I try not to. I told you this was weird, but this is what happened. I'm not sure if that old group is done trying. Maybe one night I'll find they've moved again. Until then, I'll be here walking these halls in the dark, making sure they never finish what they started. I remember the exact day it started. I was standing in the small bathroom brushing my teeth after dinner. The station's fluorescent light flickered above me, and the wind outside whipped against the thin walls. That wind never stops in the Andes. It rattles the windows, whistles through every crack, and reminds me how far I am from everything else. I'm here alone. No other workers, no visitors, no immediate help if something goes wrong. I'm used to that. I came here to study weather patterns and gather data, so solitude is just part of the deal. But that night, something felt different. Something shifted in the air. I finished brushing my teeth and leaned forward to rinse my mouth. When I stood upright, I noticed my reflection in the mirror. It was me, but his movement felt a split second late. It wasn't obvious at first. I shrugged it off as my eyes playing tricks on me. I had been analyzing charts all day and straining my eyes. Maybe my mind was just tired. I switched off the light, left the bathroom, and tried not to think about it. The next morning, I woke up with a dull ache in my shoulders. I'd slept on my side too long, and the thin mattress never gave me much support. I put on my jacket, stepped outside, and felt the sharp cold on my face. The sky was bright. The peaks looked massive, and the air tasted clean but thin. It was the usual routine. Check the instruments on the roof, record the temperature, measure humidity, and make a quick note of any changes in the wind patterns. The anemometer squeaked as it spun around, and I made a mental note to grease it later. The day passed without any major excitement. I spent hours at my workstation, keying data into the computer, reviewing satellite images, and double-checking the instruments. The heater hummed in the corner, fighting off the persistent chill. I drank at least 6 cups of coffee because the cold can creep into your bones and I need the caffeine to stay sharp. By the time I closed my laptop, it was late. My neck felt stiff, and my back was tense. I decided to take a quick shower before bed. I walked into the bathroom, turned on the light, and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror again. That's when I noticed it a second time. My reflection turned its head just a little too late. It wasn't a big delay, but it was there. I froze. I stood there staring at my reflection for a good minute. My heart thumped in my chest and I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I lifted my hand in front of my face, and the reflection did the same, almost at the same time. But not quite. It was off by maybe half a second. I stepped closer and examined the mirror. It's an old mirror, a bit scratched around the edges. I pressed a finger against the glass and felt its cold surface. The reflection's finger lined up with mine, but it still felt out of sync. I blinked, telling myself I was overtired. Maybe I'd been inside too long. Maybe my eyes were dry from the high altitude. I turned off the light, left the bathroom, and tried to ignore the jitters crawling up my spine. The next few days I kept a close eye on that mirror. The delay got worse. It wasn't constant. Sometimes it was barely noticeable, and sometimes it was very clear. On day 4, while I was washing my face, I saw my reflection blink a full second after I did. I dropped the soap into the sink. My heart pounded, and my throat felt tight. The water kept running, and my hands started shaking. I stared at that mirror, waiting. My reflection stared back. I turned my head to the left, and he turned his head a moment too late. By then, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I tried a different mirror that I keep in the bedroom. It's a small hand mirror I use sometimes when trimming my hair. The reflection was normal. Everything lined up fine. So I thought maybe the bathroom mirror was warped or defective. I pulled it off the wall one evening. I touched the back side and checked if it was some kind of weird electronic device or a double layer of glass. It looked perfectly normal. Just an old mirror with a cheap wooden frame. But whenever I hung it back up, the reflection acted strange again. I started avoiding that bathroom mirror. I'd brush my teeth in the kitchen sink, or I'd use the small hand mirror to shave. But the problem didn't go away. If I accidentally glanced at the bathroom mirror while passing by, I'd see it. The reflection moved out of sync or stood still when I moved. It made my skin crawl. I couldn't understand why it was happening. I hadn't told anyone about it, obviously, because there was no one around. And there wasn't a phone call or a radio transmission that would help me explain this. I thought about sending an email to one of my colleagues in the city, but what would I say? Hey, I think my mirror is broken because it's showing a delayed reflection? They'd think I was losing my mind. One night around 11, I walked past the bathroom. The door was half open, and the light was off. I felt this urge to look inside. I don't know why. The hallway was dimly lit by a small ceiling lamp. I stepped into the bathroom doorway and looked at the mirror. At first, I only saw darkness. Then my eyes adjusted. In the reflection, I saw a shape. It was my own silhouette, but it looked like it was closer to the mirror than I was. It was almost leaning forward. I could see the outline of a head and shoulders. My hair stood on end. I reached in and flipped on the light. The silhouette snapped into place with me like it was startled too. I stood there breathing heavily, my pulse racing, trying to calm down. I walked away, but I couldn't sleep well that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that silhouette watching me. I started having nightmares about it. I'd see myself in the mirror, but it wouldn't move when I moved. It would stand there, smiling or staring blankly, while I tried to turn away. Then I'd wake up in a cold sweat. I'd open my eyes, see the ceiling of my small bedroom, and hear the wind howling outside. I tried to shake it off as just stress or cabin fever. Things escalated about a week later. I had just finished collecting the afternoon readings from the instruments. My gloves were stiff with cold and my nose felt numb. I stepped back inside, closed the door, and stamped the snow off my boots. Then I headed for the bathroom because I needed to wash my face. It felt chapped from the wind. I turned the faucet handle, let the water run, and bent down to splash some on my cheeks. When I looked up, my reflection wasn't just delayed. It was doing something entirely different. I was leaning forward with water dripping from my chin, but my reflection was standing upright, staring at me with wide eyes. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back from the sink, almost slipping on the wet floor. My reflection lifted its hand and pressed it against the mirror from its side. It looked like it was trying to reach out. I felt a chill go through me. I could see my reflection's mouth moving, but there was no sound. It looked like it was saying something, or maybe just exhaling. My heart hammered so loud I thought my chest might burst. I felt my legs shaking and my vision narrowed like I was about to faint. But I kept looking. Then the reflection pounded its fist on the inside of the mirror. I heard nothing, but I saw its desperate expression. It was terrifying. It looked like me, but it felt like another person trapped behind that glass. I stumbled backward out of the bathroom and slammed the door. My throat felt dry, and my skin felt prickly. I slid down to the floor in the hallway, trying to catch my breath. My arms were shaking, and I felt lightheaded. For the next hour, I just sat there, refusing to look at the bathroom door. My mind raced with 100 explanations, but none of them made sense. I wondered if I had a fever or if the altitude was causing hallucinations. But deep down, I knew I'd seen something real. I could feel it in my gut. That evening, I tried to distract myself by organizing my work area. I rearranged some papers, made sure the data logs were in order, and prepared a new set of charts. I didn't want to deal with the mirror, but the tension in my chest didn't go away. My thoughts kept drifting back to that reflection pounding on the glass. Around midnight, I couldn't handle it anymore. I needed to check again. I wanted to see if it was still happening or if it had been some bizarre trick of the light. So I grabbed a flashlight and approached the bathroom door. I felt sweat beading on my forehead. My palms were clammy. When I opened the door, the bathroom light was off, so I switched it on. The mirror showed me my normal reflection. I slowly moved my hand to the side, and the reflection did the same. I leaned forward, and it leaned forward. It was perfectly synchronized. I began to question everything I'd seen before. But as I was about to turn off the light, my reflection lifted its arms without me moving mine. It placed both palms on the mirror, like it was trying to push through. I froze. My own arms were down at my sides. My reflection's face was twisted with fear or desperation. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I didn't move. I felt stuck in place, like I couldn't run or speak. Then, just as quickly, it lowered its arms and matched my stance again. It seemed like it was trying to communicate. I swallowed hard and turned off the light. I shut the door and walked back to my bedroom, my legs feeling unsteady. Over the next few days, I avoided the bathroom mirror completely. I started washing up in a different corner of the station, where there was a metal sink and no reflection. My beard grew out a bit because I didn't want to shave. I didn't want to see whatever was behind that glass. But after about 3 days of that, I got sick of hiding. I decided to face it again. I needed to see if there was a pattern, or if I could somehow figure out what it was trying to say. I set up a camera in the bathroom. It was a cheap digital camera I used for recording weather anomalies. I positioned it on a tripod, aiming at the mirror. I left the lights on and pressed record. Then I stepped out, closed the door, and waited in the hallway for about 15 minutes. The entire time I felt my stomach churning. I kept glancing at my watch, tapping my foot, trying to decide how long I should wait. Finally, I stepped back inside, grabbed the camera, and turned it off. I connected it to my laptop to check the footage. All I saw in the video was my reflection acting perfectly normal whenever I walked into view. No weird delays, no separate movements. Just me, at least on the footage. Feeling frustrated, I decided to test it live. I went into the bathroom again, stood in front of the mirror, and pressed record on the camera. I moved my arms up and down, blinked my eyes, and even said a few words to see if anything odd happened. This time, the reflection stayed in sync. Nothing odd appeared. I checked the camera feed on the laptop again, and it looked normal. But the moment I turned the camera off, I caught a glimpse of the reflection moving its head on its own. It was so quick I almost missed it. That was enough to make me realize it wasn't going to show itself when recorded. It was like it knew. I felt my hands start to shake and my throat got tight again. A few hours later, I tried to sleep, but it was no use. I kept thinking about that reflection's face. It looked like it was in pain. It looked like it needed help, or maybe it was warning me about something. My body felt tense and I couldn't get comfortable in my bed. The blanket felt heavy, and the wind outside was louder than ever. The next day, I forced myself to look at the mirror in daylight. Sometimes the reflection would just stare at me with a concerned expression. Other times it would trace lines in the air, like it was pointing or drawing something. I tried to mimic its gestures, but I never understood the pattern. It was like a silent conversation with no clear message. Each session would leave me drenched in sweat. My heart rate spiked. I'd have to walk away and breathe deeply, trying to steady my nerves. At one point, the reflection started pressing its ear to the mirror, like it was listening for something on my side. I leaned in and did the same, curious and scared at the same time. I didn't hear anything except my own breathing and the faint hum of the station's electrical systems. Then the reflection pulled back and made a motion with its hands, like it was turning an imaginary crank. I had no idea what that meant. My hands shook while I tried to repeat the motion. It shook its head like it was frustrated. My whole body was tense. I felt a knot in my stomach. Days have passed now, and I still see it in that mirror. It's quieter when I ignore it, but if I look for more than a few seconds, it starts making these gestures again. Sometimes it looks desperate, and sometimes it looks angry or upset. I've tried searching for logical explanations, but nothing fits. I also tried covering the mirror with a towel, but I felt this strange pull to uncover it, like I couldn't just leave it hidden. Something in me wants to know what it's trying to say, even though I'm terrified every time it moves on its own. I've considered leaving the station, but I have 2 more weeks before my scheduled pickup. This place is hard to reach, and the helicopter only comes once a month. I'm stuck here. All I can do is keep collecting data, keep making my daily reports, and keep living with that mirror in the bathroom. Sometimes I feel it watching me through the door, like it can sense me even when I'm not in front of it. I still don't have answers. I sleep with the light on most nights now. My appetite is shot and I feel nervous all the time. But as far as I can tell, that reflection hasn't tried to harm me. It looks like it wants to communicate. I've tried talking to it. I've tried writing on a piece of paper. I've tried everything I can think of. But it keeps making those strange gestures. I keep thinking maybe it's warning me of some weather disaster, or maybe it's just stuck in another place. Either way, I can't do much but wait for my pickup date and hope I'm not losing my mind. That's all I can say for now. This is exactly what happened. No fancy descriptions, no hidden meaning. Just a mirror, a reflection that doesn't follow the normal rules, and me, a weather scientist who can't leave until the helicopter arrives. My next step is to keep a close eye on it, in case it changes again, or in case it finally tells me something I can understand. I don't know what else to do. All I know is that every time I see that reflection move on its own, my body reacts like I'm in danger. My heart races, my breath shortens, and I can't stop looking. It's like a fear I can't shake, but I can't ignore it either. I have to face it day after day until I can finally get out of here. That's what's happening to me right now in this isolated station in the Andes, and that's all I have to say. I got that Victorian dresser at a small auction outside the city. I thought it was going to be an easy flip. I restore antique furniture, so I'm always on the lookout for unique pieces. When I first saw this dresser, I noticed its chipped veneer and missing hardware. The style had potential, so I placed the highest bid. I didn't suspect anything weird at the time. It just seemed like another old piece of furniture. But the first night I spent with that thing in my workshop changed everything. I brought the dresser home in my pickup truck. I carried it into my workshop around sunset. The place is in my backyard, away from the main house. It's a single-room garage with concrete floors, wooden shelves on every wall, and a strong smell of varnish. I keep the overhead lights bright, but at night, the shadows collect behind the workbenches. It's not usually creepy in there, but something felt strange that evening. I remember locking up and heading back into the house, feeling uneasy, but I ignored it. I usually get up early to start projects, but around 3 in the morning, I woke up for no reason. I sat up in bed and I heard a faint noise. It sounded like a whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind or a loose window, but the sound was too clear. I got out of bed, threw on a t-shirt, and went to the window. It was quiet outside. The trees weren't moving. No wind. I stood there listening. Nothing but silence. Then I heard it again, like someone talking under their breath. My heart started pounding. I forced myself to walk outside. The air was cool, and the grass felt wet under my feet. I stepped into my workshop and turned on the lights. Everything looked normal, but I still felt off. I checked the dresser. Its top was covered with paint cans and sandpaper. I looked around the workshop. No one was hiding there. I tried to shake off the feeling and went back to bed. The next day, I started removing the old finish from the dresser. I used a chemical stripper, which has a strong smell. My eyes watered a bit. My hands felt sticky through the gloves. I scraped off the varnish layer by layer. The wood underneath had a dark tone, which was common in Victorian pieces. The drawer slides were uneven. I made a note to replace them. I worked until dinner, then locked up. That night I heard it again around the same time, 3 a.m. A whisper. It sounded like my name. I sat up in bed, heart racing, arms tense. I tried to calm myself, but my mind was going wild. I walked to the workshop again. I opened the door, and the smell of chemical stripper still lingered in the air. The fluorescent lights flickered for a second before turning on fully. The dresser sat in the middle of the room. Everything else was silent. I swallowed hard and stepped closer. I heard a whisper again, but this time it was louder. It seemed to come from inside the drawers. I felt sweat on my forehead. I felt shaky. I tried pulling the top drawer open, but it was stuck. My palms felt damp. My chest felt tight. I could hear my heartbeat. Then the whisper stopped. I stood there for a long time, waiting for any other sound. Nothing. I eventually went back inside. I couldn't fall asleep for an hour or so. My thoughts kept spinning. Why would I hear a whisper calling my name? I convinced myself it was stress or a trick of the wind. The next morning, I tried to stay busy. I replaced the drawer slides, sanded the frame, and checked the corners for woodworm. I found a few holes, but nothing too serious. I felt that same uneasy tension in my stomach. I forced myself to push past it and keep working. When I locked up that night, I glanced over my shoulder at the dresser. It looked normal under the work lamp. Just wood, nails, and old finish. I went to bed and tried to ignore the anxiety. I even took a hot shower to relax. I fell asleep around midnight, and again 3 a.m. came. I woke up and heard the whisper. It was clearer now. It said things about me that I never told anyone. It mentioned a personal mistake I made years ago. It described a small object I once stole from a coworker. My mouth went dry. I felt goosebumps on my arms and neck. I could barely breathe. I jumped out of bed and ran outside. I nearly tripped on the back steps. I flung the workshop door open, flicked on the light, and stared at the dresser. The whisper came again, but louder. It came from the bottom drawer this time. My legs felt weak. I yanked the bottom drawer open. It was empty except for some old nails and dust. I felt the inside corners, expecting a hidden speaker or a phone. There was nothing. Then it spoke. It said my name again, and it repeated details about my personal life, details that made my stomach churn. There was no one else in the workshop. The voice was coming from the dresser. I stumbled back and grabbed a nearby screwdriver. My hands shook. I stepped closer and demanded to know what was happening. The whisper answered, but it didn't say who or what it was. It just kept talking about me, listing things I did that I regret. My chest got tight and I felt tears in my eyes. I felt shame and fear at the same time. I yelled at the dresser to stop, but the whisper grew louder. It told me it had more secrets. It said it could share them with the world or keep them hidden. I stood there breathing hard, sweat rolling down my face, feeling trapped. After a minute, the voice faded away. I stood in silence, panting and holding the screwdriver. I tried to calm my breathing, but my pulse was racing. My whole body trembled. I locked up again and went to the house. I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch, staring at the wall, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself I was hallucinating. Maybe I inhaled too many chemicals. But everything felt too real. I remembered every word the dresser said. The next day, I decided to check the dresser thoroughly. I turned it upside down. I removed the drawers one by one. I checked for hidden compartments, modern electronics, or anything that could produce a sound. I found old wood, nails, screws that had turned black with age, and some splinters. Nothing unusual. I tapped every inch of the wood. It was solid. There was no device inside. I started to feel sick to my stomach. I had no logical explanation. I thought about returning the dresser to the auction house, but I knew they wouldn't take it back without a valid reason. Telling them it whispered secrets to me would make me look crazy. I paced around my workshop, fighting with my thoughts. I tried to focus on simple tasks, cleaning my tools, vacuuming sawdust, wiping down surfaces. The entire time I felt the dresser behind me, almost like it was watching me. That night I tried to stay up so I wouldn't be startled. I set an alarm for 2:45 a.m. I sat in the living room, coffee cup in hand, flipping through random TV channels. When the alarm went off, I felt a jolt of adrenaline. My stomach tightened. I walked outside in the dark. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I opened the workshop door, leaving the lights off for a moment. Everything was quiet. Then I heard the whisper again. This time it spoke in a more direct tone. It said it wanted to make an offer. It said it had information that could ruin my life. It told me I should listen. My legs felt heavy. I forced myself to move. I turned on the light. The whisper stopped for a moment, like it was waiting for me to get closer. My hands shook. My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a few steps toward the dresser and braced myself against the workbench. My mouth felt dry. Then the whisper returned. It spoke about my future. It said it could help me get what I wanted if I cooperated. It mentioned a difficult situation I was in with some debts I had. It told me it had the power to fix that. My head spun. I felt dizzy. I asked it how. The whisper didn't explain. It just told me it needed to stay with me. It said I needed to keep restoring it until it was perfect. Then, when it was ready, we would continue our arrangement. I felt trapped. My breathing grew shallow. My thoughts raced. I tried to ask more questions, but the dresser went silent. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to smash the dresser to pieces, but I was afraid of what it would do if I tried. Another part of me wanted to lock the workshop and never open it again. But my curiosity kept pushing me. I wanted to know how this was possible. The following day, I sanded the dresser. The old layers of finish came off under the rough sandpaper. I replaced the missing hardware with replicas I'd ordered. While I worked, I felt uneasy. My hands were sweaty and my neck felt stiff. Every so often, I would glance at the dresser, half expecting it to whisper while I was working. But it remained silent during the day. By the evening, I'd made progress. The wood felt smooth, and the new hardware fit snugly. I told myself I was just finishing a job. At night, the whisper returned. It asked if I was ready to strike a deal. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear myself trembling when I spoke. I asked what the dresser wanted. It repeated that it needed a complete restoration. It wanted to be polished, fixed, and kept safe. It said if I did that, it would keep my secrets hidden. It would also help me deal with my financial problems by guiding me to certain opportunities. I had no idea what that meant, but the dresser sounded convinced it could do it. My head hurt. I felt a stinging behind my eyes. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but I couldn't. I was too freaked out. I felt my hands shaking. The dresser started listing more secrets from my past. My chest tightened. I asked it to stop. It told me that if I refused to help it, the secrets would come out. It said everyone would know what I'd done. My whole life would unravel. I could barely breathe. I felt cornered. I found myself nodding without thinking. I just wanted it to be quiet. The whisper subsided. Over the next week, I spent every day restoring the dresser. I replaced old screws. I reinforced weak joints with wood glue. I fixed some cracks and chips with wood filler. I stained the wood with a dark mahogany finish. It smelled strong, but I wore a mask. At night, I waited for the whisper. It came every time. It watched my progress. It reminded me of my part of the deal. It said it was almost ready. I asked for details, but the dresser only repeated that I should trust it. My stomach was in knots every day. I dreaded the nights, but I kept working. When I finally applied the final coat of varnish, the wood gleamed under the workshop lights. I felt relief, but also dread. I wondered what would happen next. That night, I stood in front of the dresser and waited. The whisper started softly. It thanked me for restoring it. I could barely believe I was having a conversation with a piece of furniture. My hands were clammy. My mouth was dry. I asked about the help it promised me. The whisper said it would guide me soon, and that my secrets would remain hidden as long as I kept the dresser close. I felt my body relax a little, but I was still tense. I had no idea how it would help me. I also knew I couldn't sell it now. I left the workshop, closed the door, and went back to bed. I was exhausted. I had been sleeping in fragments for days. My mind wouldn't stop racing, but eventually I drifted off. In the morning, I walked back into the workshop. The dresser looked different now. It was polished and elegant. I touched the wood surface. It felt smooth and cool. I thought about the deal I made. I wasn't sure if I believed it, but I knew something unnatural was happening. I haven't told anyone about the dresser. I keep it in my workshop locked up when I'm not there. The whisper comes to me at night, sometimes telling me things about upcoming events or warning me about certain choices. I feel trapped in this twisted agreement, but I also feel stuck with it. My secrets remain a constant weight, and the dresser knows every single one of them. At this point, I'm just living day by day. I plan to keep my mouth shut and follow instructions when the dresser speaks. Sometimes I stand there thinking about smashing it, but I freeze. I worry about what it would do. I don't have a better option. The dresser and I have a bond now. It's not friendly. It's more like a forced partnership. Every night I listen for that whisper. I wait for it to tell me what to do next. I still feel fear each time it speaks. I don't know how this story ends, but I know I can't walk away without risking everything I've worked for. So I wake up, restore other furniture, and maintain this piece like it's the most valuable thing in my collection. I try to ignore the knot in my stomach. I try to steady my hands. But I'm always on edge, waiting to hear my name in the silence of the workshop. And it always comes. The whispers are part of my life now, and I don't see any easy way out. I still remember the way the sunlight hit the water that morning. It had a crisp, pale glow that made the ocean look strangely inviting. I was sitting on the edge of the boat, checking my gear for the 5th time, pressing on the straps to make sure everything was snug. The air felt a little colder than usual, and it made me tense. I thought it was just nerves about diving near an older wreck I hadn't explored before. Now I see it differently. I got into the water with a slow roll off the side of the boat. The shock of the cold water felt like tiny needles across my skin. My wetsuit was thick, but the initial jolt always made me gasp. As soon as I recovered from that quick hit, I checked my air gauge. It was normal. I took a few slow breaths and signaled to my buddy, but he stayed on the boat to keep an eye on the lines and equipment. We had a system where I would do the main dive, and he'd help topside. Some jobs are easier when there's not too much gear or too many people in the water. The first few feet underwater felt standard. I focused on my breathing and made slow kicks toward the rope leading down. The deeper I went, the more I noticed bits of coral and small fish swirling around. The water clarity wasn't great, but I could see enough to navigate. My heartbeat settled. I felt that usual sense of calm I always get once I'm fully submerged. I followed the rope until I reached the old ship lying at about 80 feet. Its outline had the shape of a small cargo vessel. Sections of the hull had corroded, and large holes had opened up near the bow. I hovered near the deck, shining my flashlight around. Schools of fish darted in and out of the openings. The metal walls looked jagged with rust. I turned my body to get a better angle, and saw a piece of the deck plating that had collapsed. There was an open space underneath, large enough to swim into. I checked my watch. I still had plenty of time. My air supply was fine. so I approached the gap carefully. Inside, the darkness felt thick. My flashlight beam cut through it, revealing more piles of corroded metal. I moved in slow, deliberate motions, taking care not to bump into anything that might stir up silt or collapse. Pieces of rope were tangled around shattered crates. I swam over them, scanning the area. That's when I noticed a dull glint near a cluster of broken boards. It didn't look like normal cargo. I moved closer, angling my flashlight. I saw something that looked metallic, but it had a faint shimmer around it, almost like heat waves in the air, except I was underwater. I held my breath for a second. My lungs tightened. I blinked, trying to see more clearly. It definitely had some kind of distortion around it, which was bizarre. I got closer, my heart beating faster. Reaching out slowly, I brushed the sand and debris away. It looked like a spherical object about the size of a grapefruit. It felt heavy when I picked it up. It was smooth, dark gray, and felt cold to the touch, even underwater. I brought it close to my mask and tilted it in my hand. I saw faint lines carved into its surface. They didn't form any pattern I recognized. I felt an odd buzzing sensation in my fingers, like a slight vibration. It spread up my arm to my shoulder. I thought maybe my arm was falling asleep under the weight of my gear, but it was coming from the sphere. My heart was pounding again. I decided to bring it up. I scanned the area once more. Nothing else looked interesting, so I swam back out through the gap. Once I was back on the boat, I handed the sphere to my buddy, who asked if it was some kind of device. He turned it over in his hands, said it felt like there was a faint humming to it. We stowed it in a watertight container and finished our routine. My breathing still felt unsteady. I couldn't stop thinking about that weird distortion I'd seen around the object, and how I could almost feel some kind of force around it. But I told myself not to overthink it. We headed back to shore. The ride took about an hour, and the entire time, I kept glancing at that container. I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach, like when you realize you forgot something important, but can't remember what. I tried to distract myself by checking my gear, but I would always catch myself glancing at the container again. Once we were docked, and everything was unloaded, I drove back to my apartment. I felt tired but excited about the find. My plan was to examine it more closely at home, maybe contact a specialist later. I unlocked the door to my small apartment, set my bags down, and placed the container on the table in the living room. The place smelled a bit stale, so I opened a window. Then I sat down and pulled the object out, setting it on the table under the lamp. Seeing it in normal light felt unsettling. The sphere looked darker now, and I noticed that the carved lines seemed deeper, more pronounced. I leaned in, putting my ear close to see if it made any sound. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, but I swear I could hear a low buzzing noise. It reminded me of a power transformer at a distance, that low, constant drone. I rested my hand on the sphere. My fingertips tingled again. I decided to take a quick shower. Maybe I was just worn out. In the bathroom, I let the water run hot for a while. I stood under the stream, feeling my muscles loosen. The smell of salt water faded as I washed the day off. I tried not to think about the sphere, but it kept popping into my mind. After a few minutes, I turned off the water, grabbed a towel, and walked out into the living room. The sphere was still on the table. I dried off and threw on a t-shirt and shorts. Then I heard something strange, like the faint whoosh of waves against a shore. I paused, listening. My apartment's walls are thin, so sometimes I hear neighbors. But this sound felt like it was right behind me. I turned around. Everything looked normal. The lamp was on, the windows were closed, and the overhead light in the kitchen was off. No sign of water, no sign of waves. I shook my head and tried to ignore it. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing soft splashing sounds when I closed my eyes. It felt like I was still diving. My body twitched a few times as I drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on rest and sat up, looking around the dark room. My heart was beating fast. I flicked on the bedside lamp. Nothing looked unusual, but my mouth felt dry. I got up to get a glass of water. Walking through the hallway, I felt a chill on my legs. The air felt cold and damp. I looked down, half expecting to see water up to my ankles, but the carpet was dry. I grabbed some water from the kitchen tap, took a few gulps, and tried to calm myself. I went back to bed. This time, I forced myself to sleep. I didn't wake up until about 10 in the morning. When I woke, my head felt foggy. I had that sensation you get when you've overslept. I dragged myself to the kitchen to make coffee. Then I glanced at the living room, where the sphere still sat on the table. It looked unchanged, but I couldn't help feeling like it was watching me, which made no sense. I tried to brush off the thought. I went about my day, checking emails and returning a few calls about the dive. I told a friend about the sphere, but I left out the weird parts. I just said it was some old artifact. By late afternoon, I felt a strong urge to look at it again. I walked over, picked it up, and felt that tingling sensation. My arms tensed. My throat felt tight. Then I heard that faint wave sound again, like water sloshing in a metal tub. I turned around quickly. My living room looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being underwater. I set the sphere down, then I noticed something near the window. The glass looked wet, as if condensation had formed on the inside. Small rivulets ran down the pane. I leaned in and touched it. My fingers came away damp. My first thought was that maybe I had left the window slightly open, but it was shut tight. I wiped the glass with a towel and watched the streaks reappear almost immediately. It made my stomach lurch. The temperature in the apartment felt cooler than normal. The hair on my arms stood up. I backed away and tried to distract myself by tidying up. Over the next few hours, I kept hearing little gurgling sounds like water rising in pipes. Once or twice, I thought I saw the walls ripple, but whenever I turned on a light or got closer, the effect was gone. My heart would pound each time, and I would feel a rush of adrenaline. The feeling would pass, but it would leave me shaky. I started turning on the TV just to drown out the silence. That evening, I ordered takeout because I didn't feel like cooking. While I waited, I sat in the living room staring at the sphere. At one point, I thought the carved lines on it were glowing faintly. I got up to turn on an overhead light. When I looked again, the lines were dark. My phone buzzed, letting me know the delivery driver was outside. I hurried to the door, opened it, and grabbed the food. I used that moment to step outside for a second. The hallway felt normal. No weird sounds, no dampness, no odd buzzing. Back inside, though, the air smelled musty. I put the food on the kitchen counter, opened the container, and started eating. Halfway through, I glanced toward the living room. For a split second, it looked like water was seeping from under the table. My heart jumped. I stood up, walked over, and turned on every light I could. The floor was dry. My reflection in the TV screen looked tense, shoulders hunched. I forced myself to keep breathing slowly. Later that night, I tried to relax on the couch, watch a movie, and ignore the sphere. My body felt restless. My legs kept bouncing. I paused the movie halfway through and went to the bathroom. When I flicked the light on, I saw a thin layer of water on the tiles, not enough to splash, but enough to make the floor glisten. It reflected the bright overhead light. I froze. My pulse throbbed in my neck. I reached down, touched it. My fingers came back wet. I stood and looked at the sink, the toilet, the shower. Nothing appeared to be leaking. My ears picked up a low bubbling sound, like the noise you get when water is slowly draining. I went to the living room to grab towels. As soon as I stepped out of the bathroom, I heard the sound fade. By the time I came back with towels, the floor was dry again, not even a hint of moisture. I stared at the tiles, my skin prickling. I dropped the towels on the floor and pressed one into the tiles. It stayed dry. I wanted to shout. I felt confused and unsteady. My thoughts started racing. Am I hallucinating? Did that just happen? I finally decided to lock the sphere in a closet. I put it in a shoebox, then placed that box inside a plastic storage bin in my bedroom closet. I tried to make sure no light or air could get to it. I don't even know why. It just felt like something I needed to do. Maybe if I hid it away, these weird things would stop. I went back to the living room and sat down. It felt quieter, but not peaceful, more like the pause before a thunderstorm. I must have dozed off. Around 2 in the morning, I jerked awake. My skin was cold. The couch felt damp against my bare arms. I sat up and realized there was a thin layer of water covering the floor. It reached just above my ankles. I panicked, jumping to my feet. My shorts clung to my thighs. My heart hammered in my chest. I could see ripples across the living room. The water looked dark, almost black. I hurried to the light switch and flipped it on. The water was still there, covering the entire floor. It made small waves when I moved. I was gasping for breath, trying to calm down. I sloshed across the room toward the front door, but when I opened it, everything outside looked normal. My hallway was dry. My neighbor's door was closed. I could hear the distant hum of the building's heating system. No sign of water. I looked down. My feet were wet, but the threshold of the door was dry on the other side. It made no sense. I shut the door and turned around, seeing my furniture partially submerged. I felt my body shaking. My arms trembled and my legs felt weak. I walked slowly toward the bedroom. The water rippled around my calves. When I pushed the bedroom door open, the room was also flooded. My bed was half underwater, the mattress soaked. I saw the closet door was ajar. The plastic bin I'd put the sphere in was bobbing against the wall. My chest tightened, and I felt dizzy. I forced myself to move forward, stumbling a bit as I tried to reach the bin. Each step felt heavier, like the water was thick. I bent down and grabbed the bin, yanking the lid open. The shoebox was inside, but it was soaked through. I pulled it out, half expecting the sphere to be gone, but it was still there, glistening under the dim lamplight. I picked it up, my hands shaking. It felt heavier than before. The carvings were more defined, and I could feel that buzzing in my arms, stronger now. I stood there clutching the sphere, water up to my knees in my own bedroom. My breaths came in ragged bursts. My ears buzzed, and I could hear my heart thudding. I looked around, trying to make sense of it. Then the overhead light flickered. A low hum filled the air. I thought it might be an electrical short from all the water. I braced myself, waiting for the lights to go out, but they stayed on, flickering in and out. I walked to the bed and set the sphere on the mattress. Water sloshed around me. Then I realized the water was no longer cold. It felt lukewarm, like bath water. The flicker of the light made the water look murky. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, but it wasn't there. Probably somewhere in the living room. I didn't want to go back there. My legs felt like jello. Suddenly, the water level seemed to drop. I could see it receding, pulling back from the bed and the walls. Within a minute, the floor was almost clear of water, except for a few puddles. My clothes dripped, forming a small pool around my feet. I stared at the walls, noticing no damage, no water stains. The only sign that something had happened was the wet mattress and the droplets on my arms. I could smell a salty odor, like the ocean. I stood there, chest heaving, trying to decide what to do next. My eyes landed on the sphere. I grabbed it again. It felt warm now, pulsing slightly. I walked to the window, thinking I should throw it outside, but I hesitated. Something about that idea made me feel uneasy, like it would make things worse. I glanced at the mirror on my closet door. I looked pale, my hair plastered to my forehead, my t-shirt clinging to my body. I heard another soft gurgle behind me. I spun around. Water seeped out from under the bed, spreading across the floor again. I backed away, gripping the sphere so tightly my knuckles turned white. The overhead light flickered once more, then steadied. My entire body felt tense. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the rush of blood in my ears. At that point, I had two options. Stay here and try to figure this out, or get out of my apartment. I chose to run. I found my phone, jammed it into my pocket, and headed for the door. The water sloshed around my ankles again, making me stumble. I gripped the sphere against my chest. As soon as I opened the door, the hallway was there, dry as always. The second I stepped over the threshold, I felt the water in my apartment vanish behind me. I heard a faint splash, like a wave receding. I shut the door behind me and stood there panting, water dripping onto the hallway carpet. My arms ached. I could feel the pulse of the sphere through my shirt. I didn't bother locking up. I just walked down the corridor, leaving wet footprints. My plan was to get to my car and drive to a motel. I didn't want to leave the sphere behind, because I was afraid the flooding might spread or cause more damage. When I finally reached my car, I tossed the sphere in the back seat. My clothes were soaked, and the upholstery was going to stink, but I didn't care. I turned the key, started the engine, and drove away. My headlights lit up the road in front of me. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the water creeping after me. But it was just dark pavement. I felt my limbs shaking, my body still on high alert. My throat was dry and my heart wouldn't slow down. I clenched the wheel, taking shallow breaths. The sphere sat silent in the back seat. I couldn't hear it buzzing anymore, but I sensed it. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. I haven't decided what to do next. I'm telling this as plainly as I can. My place was filling with water that vanished a moment later. I saw it with my own eyes. I felt it around my ankles, my knees. I heard it sloshing, and I smelled the salt. That's the situation. I'm sitting in my car now, outside a cheap motel. I'm still wearing damp clothes, and I'm staring at that sphere in the back seat. My gut is twisted in knots. I don't know if sleeping here will help, but I'm pretty sure I won't get much rest. That's the full story so far. It all started with that dive, with me finding that sphere in a sunken ship. Now I'm seeing water where it shouldn't be. I'm hearing waves in my own apartment. I feel like I'm losing my mind, but the physical evidence, my wet clothes, the salt smell, the damp couch, tells me this is happening. I'm going to figure out what this thing is and why it's messing with me. But for now, I just need a few hours to catch my breath and try not to freak out. I remember the first time I saw that manuscript. It was late afternoon and the reading room was empty. I was sorting through a stack of worn books in the corner near the restricted section. I had a cart full of old volumes with cracked spines and yellowed pages. I was tired, and I just wanted to finish for the day. Then I noticed a thin, dark-colored book that didn't have any markings on the spine. It was wedged between two leather-bound histories that looked centuries old. I pulled it out and felt an odd chill on my fingertips. My breath caught in my throat. I had handled thousands of books, but this one felt different. Its cover had a smooth texture, almost like polished stone. I checked for a title, but there was nothing. The pages looked like parchment, but I wasn't sure. I opened it. The writing was neat and the ink looked fresh. That was my first sign that something was off. But I was curious, so I read the first page. It described a person working in a library. He was an archivist just like me, and he was cataloging rare books for a private collection. The text listed details about his routine. Everything matched my own. It even mentioned an old desk in the corner of the staff room, where I usually kept my lunch. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it had to be a coincidence. I kept reading until I realized I was almost done with the entire text. Then I noticed a slight headache, like a dull pressure at my temples. The words started to look blurry. I blinked a few times and decided to stop. I placed the manuscript on top of my cart and pushed it back to my office. In my office, I set it on my desk and flipped through a few pages again. The text looked different from what I remembered reading moments ago. At first I thought maybe I was too tired or I'd lost my place, but I recognized small changes. A sentence on the second page now said something about a noise in the hallway. I didn't remember that detail before. My hands started to shake. I closed the book, locked my office, and went home. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that strange text and how it seemed to shift. I had no logical explanation. I tried to distract myself by watching something on my laptop, but my mind drifted back to those pages. My heart pounded every time I pictured the words. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. After a few hours of tossing and turning, I finally fell asleep. My dreams were restless, and I woke up drenched in sweat. The next day, I went to work early. I wanted to check the manuscript again, but I felt nervous. My palms were clammy and I kept swallowing hard. When I unlocked my office, I found the book on my desk exactly where I left it. I opened it. The text on the first page still mentioned an archivist who worked with antique books, but now it included a detail about him feeling ill in the morning. That matched how I felt right then. My stomach was in knots, and I had a slight headache. That freaked me out. I flipped to the next page. It referred to a discussion with a coworker about a mislabeled stack of books. About 15 minutes later, my colleague Harold walked in and told me there was a mismatch in the inventory records. I stared at him without speaking for a moment. Then I told him I would fix it. My chest felt tight. After Harold left, I flipped further. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in quick bursts. I read a few lines about a phone call from a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. It said I would hear from this friend about a favor. I slammed the book shut. I decided not to read more. I left it on the desk and forced myself to focus on routine tasks. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. It was an old friend from high school. He asked if I could help him move some furniture over the weekend. He sounded apologetic about calling out of the blue. I agreed, but my voice was shaky. I stood there for a while with my phone in my hand, staring at the locked door of my office. I felt a deep sense of unease in my chest. My heart fluttered. The manuscript was describing events in my life before they happened. My mouth went dry. I needed a glass of water, so I left my office again and went to the break room. My legs felt unsteady. I leaned on the counter, gulped some water, and tried to calm down. A wave of anxiety washed over me, and I thought I might vomit, but I held it in. I just kept thinking about what I had read and how it kept coming true. That evening, I tried to convince myself to leave the manuscript at work and ignore it, but I felt drawn to it. Part of me was afraid of what else it might say, yet I couldn't help my curiosity. I walked back into my office and lifted the book off my desk. It felt heavier in my hands, as if it had absorbed something from the air. My knees felt weak. I decided to take it home, which might have been a mistake. I didn't want anyone else stumbling on it. I also wanted to see if it would continue changing outside the library. I locked the main doors, got in my car, and placed the manuscript on the passenger seat. The drive home was tense. I kept glancing at it, half expecting it to open on its own. My mind raced with questions. I wondered who wrote it, how it worked, and why it focused on me. The roads were dark and almost empty. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles felt numb. Finally, I made it home. I rushed up the stairs to my apartment and tossed the manuscript on the kitchen table. I stared at it for a while. It looked harmless, but I knew it wasn't. I changed into more comfortable clothes, then sat at the table with the book in front of me. I rubbed my eyes. My head pounded, and my chest felt tight again. My curiosity won. I opened it to the first page. Now it mentioned me bringing it home. The text described the layout of my apartment, the paint peeling near the windowsill, and even the coffee mug I had left out that morning. My jaw clenched. I flipped to the last page I'd read earlier. It now featured a new line about me feeling a strange urge to read further. It was accurate. I felt that urge right then. I turned the page. It described me feeling a sudden chill in the room, which happened at that exact moment. I looked at the window, but it was closed. There was no draft, yet the room felt colder. My arms broke out in goosebumps. I stood up and paced around the kitchen. My mind was screaming at me to stop, but my pulse was racing with a dangerous kind of excitement. I sat back down and read more. The text mentioned that I would spill a glass of water soon. A few minutes later, I reached for my water bottle, knocked it over, and soaked a stack of papers on the table. I cursed under my breath, grabbed some paper towels, and dried the mess. That confirmed it again. The manuscript was predicting everything. My chest felt like it was going to cave in. I shut the book and put it on a shelf. I decided not to touch it for the rest of the night. I tried to watch a TV show, but I couldn't focus. My leg bounced up and down, and my eyes kept drifting to the shelf. Finally, I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. I woke up every couple of hours, worried that I might find the manuscript in a different place. Morning came with a gray light that felt heavy. I checked the shelf. The book hadn't moved. I felt a bit of relief. I got dressed, made some coffee, and tried to act normal. But my stomach was tight and my hands trembled. I packed the manuscript in my bag and headed to work. I thought about throwing it in a dumpster, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It felt risky, like I might be making something worse happen. At the library, I locked it in a cabinet. I told myself I would leave it there and not open it for the rest of the day. But around lunchtime, my chest felt so tight that I could hardly breathe. My thoughts kept returning to it, telling me to check if it had updated again. Finally, I gave in. My heart pounded as I unlocked the cabinet and took out the book. I flipped through the pages, seeing if anything had changed. It had. It mentioned my plan to lock it away, my growing anxiety, and my return at lunchtime. It even said I would read about an upcoming visitor to the library who would ask for a rare document. I heard footsteps outside my office, and a stranger knocked on my door. He asked if we had a record from the 1800s about local property lines. I told him I'd check. He thanked me and left. By now I felt lightheaded. I realized that each time I read the manuscript, my real world shifted to match it. But there was more than that. Little details started changing around me. My desk chair had a rip in the fabric that I didn't remember. A portrait in the hallway was gone, replaced by a different painting. Harold mentioned a detail about the library budget that I'd never heard of. I felt trapped in this new version of my life. I started to panic. My hands felt clammy and my mouth was dry. I couldn't think straight. I wondered if destroying the manuscript would stop these changes. But what if it made everything worse? I sat at my desk, staring at the closed book. I was afraid to look at it again, but I feared ignoring it as well. After a few minutes, I decided to test something. I opened the book just enough to read a single sentence. It said I would drop my keychain in the hallway and not notice until someone returned it. I snapped the book shut, rushed out of my office, and headed to the break room. My keychain fell out of my pocket on the way, but I didn't realize it. 5 minutes later, Harold came in holding my keys. He said he found them near a cart of returns. My stomach twisted. The manuscript's control seemed absolute. At that point, I felt a surge of anger. My heartbeat thundered, and my breathing came in sharp gasps. I took the book and carried it down to the library's basement. I found an empty storage room with concrete walls and no windows. I locked the door behind me, turned on a single overhead light, and put the manuscript on a dusty table. My hands were sweaty. I felt my shoulders tense. I flipped open to the first blank page at the back. I wanted to see if I could alter it. I grabbed a pen and wrote, "I will leave this room and forget about the book forever." Nothing happened. The words didn't move or disappear. I flipped back to the earlier pages, and they still described what had happened to me. I didn't see any new line about my attempt. My phone buzzed in my pocket and I nearly jumped. I checked it. Harold was calling to ask why the basement door was locked. He needed to get to a supply closet. My face felt hot. I told him I'd be right there. I closed the book, left it on the table, and walked out. I unlocked the door and Harold gave me a strange look, but he didn't ask any questions. The entire time, my heart thumped so hard I felt a headache coming on. Now I keep thinking about the changes in my surroundings. Certain items in the library appear different every day. I spot details I can't explain, like a painting that looks new, but has a plaque saying it's been there since before I was hired. My coworker Linda mentioned a training session I don't remember. When I checked my email, there was a thread about it. My name was on the attendee list. I had no memory of going. It's like my life is being rewritten piece by piece. I haven't opened the manuscript again, but I feel its presence in the basement. Every few hours I sense a tug in my chest, like I should go read it. I fight that urge. I keep hoping these changes will stop, but they haven't. The world around me keeps shifting in small ways and I can't prove anything to anyone. They look at me like I'm losing it. I've avoided telling them the full story. It sounds insane, but I know it's real. I can see it in the everyday details that keep warping. It's all because of that manuscript. And now I don't know if it's safer to read it or avoid it. I'm not sure how long I can stand this uncertainty. Each day I check the basement door to make sure it's still locked. It always is, but I feel a pull to unlock it and open the book again. I don't know if I'll be able to resist forever. For now, I'm stuck in this limbo, wondering if the next small detail I notice will be the start of another chain reaction. My life is out of my control, and that feeling is worse than anything I've experienced before. I can't see a clear way out. Every time I close my eyes, I picture those shifting words on yellowed pages, waiting to tell me what happens next. I still remember how my pulse sped up the first time I unlocked the front door of that old farmhouse. The paint on the walls looked dry and cracked, and the wooden floors gave off a dull creak every few steps. My car was parked outside on a gravel driveway, and the only other sounds I heard were the distant hum of insects and the shuffle of tree branches in the evening breeze. I carried my suitcase into the living room and set it down near a fireplace filled with cold ashes. I felt a slight sense of thrill as I realized this would be my place for the next few months. I wanted solitude, and I thought this place would let me focus on my next book. I had no idea I'd end up dealing with something more intense than writer's block. When I first walked around the house, I noticed the chipped window frames and the faint smell of must lingering in the hallway. The furniture came with the property: a few dusty chairs, a large oak desk, a narrow bed in the upstairs bedroom, and a small round table in the corner of the living room. The realtor had told me this was a historic place. She said that a group of artists and writers used to gather here long ago, but she never mentioned anything about them still being around in any form. She just said it with a polite smile and handed me the keys. That first night, I set up my laptop on the oak desk and tried to write a few paragraphs of my new manuscript. My story felt dull, and I couldn't lock onto a real rhythm. I got annoyed at myself, so I decided to explore the house more. I stood in front of the mantel above the fireplace and traced my fingers across a few scratches in the wood. They looked like someone had carved letters there, but they were so faded I couldn't read them. I heard the floor creak behind me, and I spun around fast. No one was there. I went upstairs and checked the single bedroom. The walls were a pale green, and an old wardrobe sat near the window. I dragged my feet over to it and found it empty. A slight draft came in from the edges of the window. It made the curtains flutter a bit. I felt uneasy, like someone was watching me, but I kept telling myself it was just the new environment. I was alone in a big place at night. I tried to ignore my nerves, sat on the bed, and typed a few more words on my laptop. Then I heard something. It sounded like a faint voice downstairs, but I couldn't make out the words. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked to the staircase. I didn't see anything. The living room lights were still on, and the fireplace looked the same. I walked around for a minute, then decided to go to bed early. The next day, I woke up around 6 in the morning. I made some coffee using the small kitchen that was attached to the back of the house. The stove was old, but it worked. The place felt less eerie in daylight, and I spent most of the morning cleaning. I dusted shelves, wiped surfaces, and tried to air out the musty smell by opening the windows. At around noon, I sat down at the desk again, determined to make progress on my book. I managed to get a page written, but I wasn't satisfied with the flow. I glanced around the room to distract myself, and that's when I saw a figure near the fireplace. It was a woman dressed in old-fashioned clothes. She wore a long skirt and a buttoned blouse. She stood there with her hands folded, looking down at the floor. I froze in my seat. I could feel my heart pounding and my palms got sweaty. She didn't move. I didn't hear breathing or any other sound. I stood up slowly, and as I took a step toward her, she faded. She didn't disappear instantly. She just blurred until she wasn't there anymore. I felt cold sweat on my forehead. I checked the time on my phone to make sure I wasn't dreaming. It was just after noon, and I was wide awake. I tried to make sense of what I had seen. It hadn't felt like a daydream. I walked to the spot near the fireplace, pressed my hand against the wall, and looked around. There were no hidden projectors, no mirrors, no signs of any trick. It just felt normal, except I knew what I'd witnessed. My hands were still shaking, so I went outside to catch my breath. The fresh air helped me calm down. I noticed the house from the outside had a sagging roof near the back. Some of the shutters were missing. It looked like an old shell, but it didn't seem haunted at first glance. Yet something was there. I went back inside after a few minutes. I didn't see anything else that day, but I felt the tension in my shoulders. That night, I returned to my desk. I kept writing, but I couldn't ignore the memory of that figure. Around 9 p.m., I stood up to stretch. I heard faint music coming from the far corner of the living room. It sounded like a piano melody, soft and slow. My chest tightened and I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. There was no piano in the house and I couldn't locate any device that would play that sound. I walked toward the corner, and that's when I saw a second figure. It was a man in a loose shirt standing near a small group of people who seemed to be sitting in chairs. I blinked hard, but they didn't vanish. They were semi-transparent, like a light haze was passing through them, but I could see their shapes and details clearly enough. I could see one man holding a quill pen. Another person, a woman, was reading from a small book. The man in the loose shirt tapped his foot in time with the piano music I heard. I couldn't see the piano itself, but the music felt real, as if it surrounded us. I didn't move, and I tried to slow my breathing. My heart was hammering, and I felt my stomach clench. I thought about running outside, but something kept me there. I watched them. They seemed to be in their own moment, not noticing me. Then, after maybe 20 seconds, the scene faded. The music vanished. I was left standing in a silent room again. I walked to the mantel and sat on the floor, my back against the wall. I felt a slight ache in my knees. I leaned forward and looked at the dusty floorboards. I whispered to myself, "What is going on?" My voice sounded weak in the empty room. I couldn't sleep that night, so I paced around the house, stepping over old rugs, checking the windows, and seeing if there was anything outside. There was nothing but moonlight and the vague outline of trees in the yard. Over the next few days, these events became more frequent. In the late afternoon or early evening, I'd catch glimpses of these old-fashioned people appearing in the living room or near the fireplace. Sometimes I heard a violin, sometimes a poet reciting lines, sometimes the rustle of papers. Each time they repeated the same actions: reading, writing, playing music, sharing words with each other. They seemed caught in a loop. They never acknowledged me. It was like they were reenacting a gathering that happened decades ago. One evening, I tried something different. I sat down at my desk and began to write a scene describing a man in old clothes standing near the fireplace. I wrote down everything I had seen. While I typed, I noticed a faint glow in my peripheral vision. When I looked up, I saw that same man appear again. But this time, he turned his head toward me, almost as if he heard me tapping on the keys. My skin prickled and I felt a jolt in my chest. I kept writing, describing him in more detail. His shoes, his hair, the lines on his face. He didn't vanish. He stood there like he was waiting. I got an idea. I started describing a conversation. I wrote something like, "He takes a step toward my desk and says, 'Why are you here?' Right after I finished typing that sentence, I heard a faint whisper, 'Why are you here?' I jumped up, knocking my chair back. My heart pounded and my arms shook. He had repeated the line I typed. Then he vanished. I stood there, breathing fast. My throat felt dry. My mind raced with questions, but I realized I'd just made contact. Over the next several nights, I tested this ability. I'd write short lines and I'd see them respond. Sometimes I'd hear them speak the exact words I'd put on paper. Other times I'd see them perform an action I'd described. It felt like a bizarre collaboration. They were stuck in their endless cycle, but my writing seemed to break through that pattern here and there. Each appearance left me sweating and tense, but also curious. One afternoon, I wrote a short passage describing a scene where one of them sat with me at the desk, both of us working on a poem. As soon as I finished typing, the figure of a middle-aged woman appeared in the chair beside mine. She placed a quill pen on the desk, though I couldn't see any physical quill there. She looked directly at me for the first time. I could see the faint lines around her eyes. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Then she looked down at my screen, pointed at one sentence, and nodded. A second later, she faded again. That brief moment of shared space made my skin crawl with excitement and fear. I felt sweat gathering at my temples, but I also felt an urge to keep going. As time passed, I noticed that these interactions produced strange pieces of writing. I'd craft a few lines on my own, then I'd see them appear. They'd add lines or gestures that I hadn't planned, and I'd type those details into my manuscript. When I read over it later, the text felt like it was from two different eras woven together. Some of the words didn't fit modern usage, and the rhythm felt unusual. But it also felt compelling. It was like these scenes existed outside my normal writing process. Every time it happened, I'd end up with pages that I couldn't replicate on my own. I started paying attention to the times they appeared. It was usually late at night or early in the morning, and often around the fireplace. I moved my desk closer to that area because I wanted to see if it would increase our interaction. It seemed to work. One night I wrote a line describing a small group gathering around the hearth discussing a new story. 3 figures appeared in front of me. One tapped his foot on the floor, another flipped through a thin booklet, and the third kept gesturing with her hands as if she was emphasizing a point. I typed everything I saw. My fingers felt shaky on the keyboard, but I managed to keep going. After a few minutes, they turned toward me. I sensed they wanted me to join their conversation. My breathing grew shallow, and I felt a tightness in my chest, but I typed a few lines of dialogue for myself. I stepped forward and asked them what story they want to create. Instantly, I heard a woman's voice say, "We want to build a world of words that never fades." Her voice was clear, and I realized I was making contact with something beyond my normal reality. My legs felt weak, and I gripped the edges of my desk for balance. This pattern continued for weeks. By now, I'd written dozens of pages that felt like a collaboration with these trapped figures. During the day, I'd try to read through what we'd created. Some passages didn't make sense. Some repeated old-fashioned phrases or references to events I didn't understand. Other parts had a strange power, like they were infused with the energy of these ghostly writers. They seemed hungry for expression, as if they'd been silenced for too long. At night, I still got nervous when I felt that subtle shift in the air that signaled their arrival. My pulse would jump, and I'd feel a knot form in my stomach. I kept telling myself I'd pack up and leave if things got too intense. But each new interaction pulled me deeper into the process. I'd see them appear. I'd write. They'd respond. I'd record the outcome. My days blurred. I spent most of my time in that living room, not even bothering to explore the rest of the property. One evening, I noticed something different. The group seemed to expand. I counted at least 6 people in the room. I heard more instruments, more quiet chatter. They were all writing, composing, or reading something. A few of them actually turned to me in unison. I felt sweat run down my back and my hands tingled with anxiety. I typed a question. "Is there an end to your work here?" One man answered, "We move without rest. We cannot finish." I heard his voice directly, like he was speaking next to me. Then he looked at me with tired eyes. His figure shimmered a bit. I took a shaky breath and typed another question. "What happens if we complete something together?" He paused, looked around at the others, then back at me. I didn't hear an answer this time, but his expression seemed to carry a hint of confusion. I wondered if they even knew. Over the next few nights, I pushed to finish a short play with them. It was messy. I'd type scenes in modern language, they'd add old words, and I'd try to piece it together. Each time I wrote a new segment, they'd act it out in front of me, like a living stage performance in the farmhouse. The tension in the room made my neck stiff, and I'd have to stretch my shoulders often. The air felt charged with energy. I barely slept. By the 5th night, we reached the final scene. I typed the last line. "And so we rest, finally free to leave these pages." The group recited it together, speaking in a hushed chorus. Then they faded away like mist dissolving in a breeze. The silence felt heavier than usual afterward. I sat there staring at the empty fireplace. My laptop screen still showed the text of the final line. My head pounded with exhaustion and I could feel my throat tighten. I saved the document and closed the laptop. I waited. but they didn't reappear. That night, I slept a solid 8 hours without interruption. When I woke up, the house felt different. The air felt lighter, and I didn't sense that underlying tension I'd grown used to. I walked through each room, stepping on the creaky boards, checking corners, opening closets. Nothing felt unusual anymore. I returned to my desk, opened my laptop, and read the short play. I couldn't believe how strange it was. It had lines in archaic English, odd scene directions, and references to older styles of dress and music. But it was complete. I read through it, half expecting them to appear again. They didn't. For the next few days, I tried to summon them by writing new lines, but the house stayed quiet. I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. I realized that whatever loop they were in might have ended when we finished the play together. I stood by the fireplace one last time, looking at the mantel. My body felt a bit shaky thinking about everything that had happened. There were no new voices, no shimmering figures. Just me, alone in that dusty house staring at the scratched wood. I decided it was time to leave. I packed my bags and loaded them into my car. Before I locked up, I paused at the front door. I turned around and spoke softly into the empty living room. "Thank you." Then I walked out, closed the door, and felt the gravel shift under my shoes as I headed to the car. I drove off, carrying with me a piece of work I could never have created on my own. I lost my job on a Friday afternoon. The company boss shook my hand in a cramped office and said some formal words I barely remember now. My head felt hot, and my chest felt tight. That weekend, I opened a letter from a law firm. It said I had inherited a large house from a distant relative I never met. I had nothing better to do and nowhere else to go, so I packed up my few things and drove out to see the place for myself. The house stood on the edge of a small town with narrow streets and old fences. The sky looked dull that day, and the air felt heavy. When I pulled up, I saw a worn metal gate that creaked when I pushed it open. Dry leaves crunched under my shoes. I stared at the front of the house, noticing cracks in the walls and chipped paint around the windows. The porch sagged a bit on one side. A gust of wind made the boards rattle. I swallowed hard and checked my phone, but there was no signal. I told myself I could handle it. I stepped inside and set my bags by the front door. The front hallway smelled musty, like old paper and damp fabric. My eyes watered from the dust. There was a wide staircase to the left and a dark corridor leading to the back. The place felt dead in a way I couldn't explain. The rooms had tall ceilings, peeling wallpaper, and broken light fixtures. A few chairs and tables sat around, layered in dust. I tried to flip a switch near the door, but the lights didn't come on. I sighed and reached for a flashlight in my bag. That first evening, I ate a quick meal of canned soup in the front parlor. I set up a small LED lamp on the table. Its weak light hit the old wallpaper, making the colors look even more faded. The house was silent except for an occasional groan in the walls. I told myself it was the wood settling, but it made me glance over my shoulder more than once. After I finished my soup, I decided to explore a bit. I walked through the halls, shining my flashlight on the floors and walls. The floorboards squeaked under my steps. My heartbeat stayed fast, and I kept wiping my palms on my jeans. I felt like someone was watching me. The back hallway had portraits of people I didn't recognize. Their faces looked stern, and their eyes seemed to follow me. I got this prickling feeling on the back of my neck. I tried to ignore it and pushed open a door that led to a small study. Inside, I saw a large wooden desk covered in a thick layer of dust. A shelf full of books lined one wall, the titles barely visible in the dim light. I ran my hand along the desk's surface, and the dust stuck to my fingers. That night, I slept in a second-floor bedroom I found with a serviceable bed. I spread out a sleeping bag because the sheets looked stained. Sometime around midnight, I jolted awake. I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow steps, like someone not sure where they were going. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The steps stopped for a moment, then continued. I was sure I had locked the front door, and I hadn't seen anyone else when I explored. My mouth felt dry, and I blinked in the darkness, trying to focus. I listened, holding my breath. The steps stopped outside my door. My grip on the flashlight tightened. My stomach cramped with tension. Then nothing happened. No knock, no voice. Everything went silent again. I forced myself out of bed and flipped on the flashlight. The corridor outside was empty. The air felt cold. I walked up and down, shining the beam into corners and under a table against the wall. I found nothing, but I noticed a faint smell of old flowers like dried petals. I walked back to my room and locked the door. I stayed awake another hour, just staring at the doorknob, waiting. The next morning I woke up with a stiff neck and a mild headache. I went outside to my car to look for some aspirin, but I realized I had run out. I cursed under my breath. I decided I'd go into town later to buy some supplies, but first I wanted to check the electricity and plumbing. I found the fuse box in the basement. The steps leading down were narrow and worn. The basement smelled like mildew. My flashlight beam showed puddles on the concrete floor and spider webs in the corners. I saw the fuse box against a brick wall. I flicked a few switches, but I had no idea what I was doing. After a few attempts, I got some lights to flicker upstairs. That would have to do for now. By afternoon, I tried to clean a couple of rooms. I put on some old gloves and grabbed a broom. Dust flew everywhere, making me cough. I could hear the wind outside, rattling the windows. My mind kept going back to the footsteps from the night before. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, but it sounded too much like a real person walking. I felt on edge, but I kept sweeping until I found some old journals under a chair in the study. These journals looked like property records or logs of events that had happened in the house over the years. They had dates and names, but many pages were unreadable because of water damage. I flipped through them, noticing entries about strange noises, sightings of shapes in the corridors, and mentions of a hidden room somewhere in the house. The handwriting was formal, and the ink had faded. One entry mentioned a ceremony that took place in the eastern wing, but there were no details. Another entry talked about hearing voices in the attic. My skin crawled as I read. I shut the journal and stuffed it in my bag to read later. That evening, I tried to turn on a couple of old lamps around the house. The bulbs flickered, but at least I didn't have to rely entirely on my flashlight. I heated some more soup on a portable stove I'd brought. While I ate, I kept glancing toward the corridor. Every small noise made me tense. The walls creaked. Pipes clanked once or twice, and the wind whistled outside. Around 10 o'clock, I started hearing those same footsteps again. They came from upstairs. They were slow, uneven. I felt sweat gathering on my forehead. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I turned off the stove and grabbed my flashlight, heading up the stairs. My legs felt shaky. I clenched my jaw, trying not to make a sound. When I reached the top, I heard nothing. I checked the rooms one by one. My flashlight beam exposed bare floors and dusty corners. In one room, I saw an old mirror propped against the wall. Its surface was spotted with black patches from age. As I swung the light around, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror, like a shape passing behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight behind me, but there was nothing there. My breath caught in my throat. I walked over to the mirror and touched the frame. It felt cold and smooth, covered in a thin film of dust. I backed out of the room and closed the door. I went into another bedroom with a trunk in the corner. The trunk was locked, but the lock looked rusty. I gave it a good tug and it snapped. Inside, I found old letters and a small notebook. I flipped through the letters. Most were about financial matters or family news I didn't understand. The notebook had short notes about attempts to contact someone through certain rituals. It mentioned symbols, chanting, and repeated references to a date long in the past. My stomach churned, and I felt a headache building in my temples. I took the notebook with me and left the room. I spent the next day searching for more clues. I wanted to figure out what might be going on. I found a narrow staircase at the far end of the corridor on the second floor. It led to a small attic room. The air up there felt stale. The single window was covered by a heavy cloth. I shone my flashlight around and saw boxes stacked against the walls. A few had labels. One box contained old clothes and old photographs. Another box held books about mysticism and folklore. I saw a thick volume with a leather cover. Its pages smelled like damp paper and old glue. Some of the text was in a language I didn't recognize. I flipped through it, noticing diagrams of circles, lines, and strange shapes. While I stood in that attic, I heard a soft sigh behind me. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. I spun around, but the room was empty. My chest tightened, and I grabbed the book. My hands shook a little. I left the attic and almost stumbled on the stairs. My heart was racing. I decided to take a break and clear my head, but as soon as I reached the second-floor hallway, I heard a voice whisper my name. It was so faint, I thought I imagined it. But it came again, a soft, drawn-out sound. My pulse throbbed. I raised the flashlight, but I saw only the empty hallway. I said, "Hello?" My voice came out weak. No one answered. That night, I slept on a couch in the first-floor parlor. I didn't like being upstairs anymore. I locked the doors and kept the flashlight next to me. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the ground floor. I listened, muscles tense, eyes wide. It felt like they were right outside the parlor door. I held my breath, waiting for the doorknob to turn, but it stayed still. After a few minutes, the footsteps faded away. In the morning, I opened the journals and the notebook again. I studied the old entries, scanning them for anything that matched the strange events. One passage mentioned a set of hidden rooms below the eastern wing. Another described a ritual that was never finished. The writer mentioned hearing footsteps and whispers whenever they tried to leave the house. I swallowed hard. My mind raced with questions. I flipped to another entry that described strange reflections in mirrors. I felt sweat on my brow, remembering the shape I thought I saw in that upstairs mirror. My nerves were fraying, but I felt determined. I didn't want to run away. The house was mine, and I had nowhere else to go. So I searched the eastern wing. The corridor there had a torn carpet and water stains on the walls. I knocked on the walls, listening for hollow spots. Near a corner, I heard a different sound. I pressed my hand against the paneling and felt a slight give. I pushed harder, and a section of the wall slid open. Behind it was a narrow stairwell going down. The smell hit me first, stale air and something sour. I stepped onto the stairs, holding my flashlight tight. The walls were rough stone. My footsteps sounded loud in the tight space. At the bottom, there was a door with heavy hinges. I pulled on the handle, and it opened with a scraping noise. A cramped room lay beyond. My flashlight showed an old table in the center and shelves along the walls. On the table, I saw a faded symbol drawn in red paint. It was a circle with lines inside it. My heart thumped as I recognized it from one of the books in the attic. The shelves held jars of dried herbs, melted candles, and a few tarnished metal tools. I stepped closer, hearing my breathing echo in the small room. I spotted a ledger on the table. Its cover was cracked. Inside were lists of names and dates. It mentioned gatherings in this hidden room, times when people tried to call on something. My fingertips trembled on the pages. The handwriting talked about footsteps that roamed the halls, voices that called out, and reflections of unseen watchers in mirrors. I felt sweat running down my back. I read that these phenomena were a sign that the ritual was incomplete. The final page had a single line. "It waits." I shut the ledger and backed away from the table. I felt dizzy. My mind buzzed with questions. What did they try to summon here? I ran a finger along the symbol on the table. The paint flaked off in places. My stomach twisted as I imagined people standing in this room, chanting, waiting for something to appear. I grabbed the ledger and hurried out, leaving the door open behind me. My feet pounded on the stairs, and I almost tripped once on a loose step. When I returned to the corridor, I realized the door to the hidden stairwell had slammed shut. I don't remember closing it. My breath came in fast bursts. My chest felt tight. I ran my hands through my hair, pacing back and forth. The air felt colder. I thought I heard my name whispered again, somewhere in the dark hallway. My skin tingled. I forced myself to walk back to the front parlor. I checked my phone. Still no signal. That night, I tried to stay calm by sitting near a lamp with the ledger on my lap. My eyes kept drifting to the door, expecting footsteps any second. A wind picked up outside and the old windows rattled. I read more of the ledger, noticing more references to the incomplete ceremony. The entry suggested that it had to be finished or the house would remain in a state of unrest. I felt my jaw clench and my throat go dry. The footsteps started again, pacing through the house. This time I heard them passing through the study, then into the hall, then up the stairs. My body froze, but a part of me wanted to follow, to confront whatever it was. I couldn't bring myself to do it. My legs felt too weak, and my hands shook. I managed to make it through the night without sleeping. At dawn, I stood by the window, staring at the overgrown front yard. My mind raced with everything I had discovered. The footsteps, the whispers, the old journals and ledgers, the shape in the mirror, the hidden room with that painted symbol, the mention of an ancient ritual that was never completed. My heart pounded as I thought about how the footsteps seemed more frequent now, like they wanted me to do something. I didn't know if I could face it, but I had a sense that the house wasn't going to let me go until I did. I decided to keep investigating. I wouldn't let my fear push me out of the only place I had left. I would find a way to finish that ritual or break its hold on the house. I would turn every page, search every room, and face whatever was lurking in those halls. My stomach churned at the thought, but I didn't see another choice. So I stayed, listening, watching, and trying not to fall apart while the footsteps drew closer each night. I always start my day by loading my car with camera gear. I place my tripod in the trunk, check my lenses, and make sure I have enough memory cards. I'm a landscape photographer, and I've spent years driving to remote places for unique shots. I like being alone out there. I like the early morning chill, the quiet rustle of leaves, and the way the rising sun changes everything in seconds. It's my job, but it also feels like my personal routine to keep me grounded. A few weeks ago, I heard about this valley that's supposed to have amazing light in the late afternoon. A local hiker told me the place is almost hidden by steep rock walls and thick trees. He said it feels untouched, like most people don't even realize it's there. That caught my interest immediately. I'm always searching for places that haven't been photographed a million times. So I packed my gear, filled my water bottle, and made the drive. The first day I visited, I parked my car on the side of a narrow dirt road. The path leading down into the valley was barely visible between the branches and thick undergrowth. I remember pushing aside some low-hanging vines and feeling thorns drag across my jacket. The air smelled damp. I heard insects buzzing and a faint gurgling sound from what I assumed was a stream. I carried my camera bag on one shoulder and a small backpack of snacks on the other. My tripod bumped against my leg with each step, creating a steady rhythm. When I finally reached an open spot, I saw tall trees surrounding me in a rough semicircle. In the distance, the valley opened wider, revealing more foliage and a line of distant ridges. The late afternoon sun hit the rocks in a slanted way, creating dramatic shadows. I set up my tripod, mounted my camera, and played around with angles. The place was empty, which is what I prefer. I didn't see any other cars on the road or any footprints on the trail. I took a few test shots, adjusting my shutter speed and aperture. Everything looked normal. Later that night, when I got home, I transferred the photos to my computer. At first, I scrolled through them quickly, just checking composition and lighting. Then I noticed something odd in the background of one shot. It looked like a shape, maybe a person, standing among the trees. I zoomed in. It was definitely a person. They were wearing dark clothes and their face was turned toward the camera. It was blurry, but I could make out the head shape and the stance. I didn't remember seeing anyone all day. I moved on to the next photo, and there it was again. Or maybe it was someone else, but the person had the same dark clothes and was standing in a different spot, always looking in my direction. My stomach tensed. I felt a little spike of adrenaline. I tried to recall any sounds or signs of another person while I was out there. I couldn't remember anything. No footsteps, no voices. I convinced myself it might have been a hiker passing by. Maybe they wanted to avoid disturbing me and kept their distance. The next morning, I went back to the valley. I wanted to see if I could figure out where that person might have been standing. I arrived earlier than the day before, hoping the sunlight would let me see the area more clearly. I walked around for an hour, looking at the tree line. I didn't see any footprints or signs of recent activity. The ground in that area is mostly pine needles and damp soil, so I guess footprints could vanish quickly. I shrugged it off, set up my gear, and started shooting again. This time I took more photos than usual. I tried different lenses, different angles, and even walked deeper into the valley. I was alone the entire time, at least as far as I could tell. I heard only the wind and the occasional drone of an insect. My phone had no service out there, but I didn't mind. I was focused on capturing the quiet majesty of that landscape. When I got home that evening, I went straight to my computer. I was curious to see if the unknown figure showed up again. I opened the files in a photo editor and started going through them carefully. In the first few shots, I saw nothing unusual, but in the 7th or 8th image, I saw a figure again. This time it was closer to the foreground, maybe 20 feet behind some shrubs. The figure looked almost the same, dark clothes facing my direction. The resolution was still not perfect, but I could tell it was a person. My hands shook as I zoomed in further. There was no sign of a face, just a vague shape where the head should be, but it was tilted toward me. I felt a chill on my neck. I checked more shots. They were in each one, sometimes on the far left, sometimes in the middle, sometimes near the edge of the frame. Always looking. It didn't make sense. I never saw anyone with my own eyes. I felt sweat on my forehead. My stomach hurt a little, like I had swallowed something heavy. I decided I needed to go back one more time, maybe with a friend or another photographer. But I don't usually do that. I'm a loner when it comes to my work. So I kept it to myself and thought maybe I could set up a time lapse or some kind of continuous capture, just to see if I could catch actual movement in real time. The next day, I returned in the late afternoon. I positioned my camera on a small rock ledge overlooking the valley. I started a time-lapse sequence. Then I stepped away from my camera and scanned the area with my naked eye. I looked behind trees, walked along a small stream, checked behind rocks, and found nobody. The only sounds I heard were leaves rustling in the wind and my own breath. I sat on a fallen log while the camera kept shooting at regular intervals. After about an hour, I packed up and left. That night, I downloaded the time-lapse images. There were hundreds of frames. As I flipped through them, my heart raced. In about half of them, the figure was there, always standing in some spot that seemed strategic. They grew closer in each subsequent image. On the final shots, it looked like the figure was only a few yards away from my camera. I felt a surge of panic. My chest felt tight. My mouth went dry. I realized that even when I was near the camera, I never saw anything. But the camera saw them, every single time. I couldn't sleep well that night. I lay awake thinking about the valley, that figure, and the way it seemed so intent on facing me. My mind raced with questions about illusions or camera errors. But it didn't make sense. The figure wasn't always in the same position. It moved. That indicated something was actually there. The next morning, I woke up feeling nauseated. I forced myself to eat some toast and drank coffee. I decided to drive back to the valley. I told myself I needed answers. I arrived around noon. The sunlight was high, and I felt hot air on my face. I carried my camera in hand, no tripod. I walked around with short steps, scanning the horizon and the trees. My palms were sweaty. My heart thudded in my chest. I couldn't see anyone, but I kept feeling a sensation like I was being watched. I snapped a few test photos at random intervals, pointing my camera at different angles. Then I checked the previews on the camera's display. Nothing showed up. I repeated this for an hour, methodically taking photos and checking each one. Still no sign of that figure. I felt a wave of relief. Maybe whatever happened was just in those specific moments. Or maybe it was some glitch with certain lighting conditions. Feeling a little more confident, I decided to explore deeper into the valley. I followed a narrow path that curved around a cluster of large boulders. I found a small clearing with a view of some tall pine trees. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting a dappled pattern on the ground. I set my camera to a higher shutter speed and snapped a few shots. Then I lowered the camera and looked around. Silence. Just the breeze in the trees. I was about to take more shots when I heard a branch snap behind me. I spun around, but I saw nothing. My pulse jumped. I waited a moment, listening. I heard only my own breathing. I reasoned that it could be a small animal or just a piece of dead wood falling. Still, I felt uneasy. My hands trembled. My shirt clung to my back from the sweat. I decided to wrap up and leave, but I still wanted one last series of shots from the main overlook. I made my way back up the slope to that rocky ledge. When I got there, the wind picked up. I felt it push against my body. Small rocks shifted under my feet. I braced myself, took a deep breath, and set my camera on a low rock. I took several wide-angle shots. The clouds overhead created dramatic shadows over the valley. Everything looked calm. I heard no footsteps, no snapping branches. My shoulders felt tense, but I tried to ignore it. Eventually, I headed home. I felt exhausted. I didn't even stop to buy food or coffee. I just wanted to get home and see if the photos revealed anything. The drive took about an hour. My mind was blank most of the way, except for the occasional flash of worry that I might find something in the photos. When I reached my apartment, I took a quick shower, then opened my laptop. I downloaded the photos from the camera. Everything looked normal in the first bunch of shots. No figures, no strange shapes. My muscles loosened a bit. Then I reached the shots from the overlook. In the third image of that series, I saw it again. The figure was there in the bottom right corner, between two bushes. Even from a distance, I could see the outline of the head and shoulders, facing me. In the next shot, the figure had moved closer. My mouth went dry. My fingers shook on the keyboard. I scrolled through more images. In each shot, the figure inched forward. In the final photo, it was so close it filled the lower part of the frame. I could see the edges of the clothes, dark and loose. The face area was turned up toward the camera. No features I could identify, just a slight oval shape. I felt my chest tighten so much I had trouble breathing normally. I sat there for a while, staring at the screen. My neck felt stiff. My shoulders ached. I looked around my apartment, half expecting someone to be behind me. The place was quiet. My computer's fan whirred softly. My head pounded. I closed my laptop and tried to think of something else, but I couldn't. I went to the kitchen, drank some water, and paced around the living room. I didn't know what to do. Should I talk to the police? Tell them I have photos of a person who never appears in real life but shows up in every shot? That sounded insane. Should I just stop going to the valley? That idea bothered me, because I was so sure those photos could be special. But the situation was too weird. 2 days passed before I even looked at my camera again. I jumped whenever I heard a noise outside my window. I felt jumpy every time my phone buzzed, but I couldn't stop thinking about that place. So I made a decision. I'd go back one final time. I'd set up a video camera on a tripod, let it roll while I took still photos, and see if anything showed up in the video. If I captured footage of someone creeping around, I could have some proof. I arrived at the valley in the late afternoon again. The sun was casting long shadows. I felt nervous, like my stomach was tied in a knot. I set up the tripod with the video camera near the same rocky ledge. I pointed it outward and pressed record. Then I moved to the side and started taking still photos, panning slowly. The air felt heavy on my skin. The silence pressed on my ears. My heart pounded. I paused every few minutes to check behind me, but nothing was there. After an hour, I stopped. I grabbed my gear and hiked out of there as fast as I could without running. I tried not to look over my shoulder too much, but I couldn't help it. Each time I saw nothing. Finally, I reached my car. I threw my stuff in the trunk and drove away, keeping the radio off so I could listen for any strange sounds. All I heard was the engine and my breathing. Back home, I reviewed the video first. I saw myself walking around, adjusting my camera, taking shots. I saw the leaves moving in the wind, but I didn't see any person or strange figure in the video footage. There was no one behind me, no one stepping forward in the distance. Then I opened my still photos. My throat went tight. The figure was in almost every shot again, closer each time. But the video camera, which was running the whole time, showed nobody. It was as if the figure existed only in the still frames. That's when I realized I couldn't keep doing this. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy. My arms felt weak. I put away my camera and shut down my computer. I sat on my couch shaking. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to try anymore. I decided that I had enough of that valley. I haven't returned since. I still have all those photos, but I don't show them to anyone. They remain on a separate hard drive in my closet. I won't delete them, but I can't stand to look at them. Sometimes I think about going back to see if anything has changed. But every time I consider it, my chest tightens and I feel that same creeping sensation of being watched. I've done a lot of photography in other places since then, and I haven't had any strange occurrences. Maybe whatever happened there only lives in that valley, and I'm not going back to find out. That's the story of how I discovered something I can't explain. It's still there in those photos, staring back at me whenever I dare to open those files. I don't have an answer, and I'm not sure I want one.